Part 2. Conquering the Skyline, Manhattan Real Estate and Public Policy, 1968 to 1983. Chapter 11. Relocation to Manhattan. The apartment on 3rd Avenue smelled of fresh paint and possibility, and neither scent was entirely trustworthy. Donald Trump stood at the window of his new Manhattan residence in the early 1970s, a modest apartment by the standards he was already projecting for himself, functional rather than impressive, a staging point rather than a destination, and looked out at a city that appeared from this particular elevation and in the specific quality of late afternoon light that Manhattan produces in autumn, to be exactly what he had always imagined it to be: vertical, indifferent, magnificent, and available to whoever had the nerve and the preparation to make a claim on it. The street below moved with the purposeful density of a city that still believed in its own centrality, that had not yet fully registered the fiscal signals accumulating in the offices of the city controller and the bond rating agencies that would, within a few years, produce the most dramatic municipal financial crisis in American history. The trash cans on the corner were overflowing. A section of sidewalk 2 buildings north had been excavated for utility work and not yet restored, the plywood covering its perimeter weathered past the point of suggesting imminent resolution. Trump noted these things with the quick, cataloging attention that rent collection rounds in Brooklyn and Queens had trained into him, and then he looked past them, the way a man looks past the condition of a distressed property toward the value its distress is temporarily obscuring. He was in Manhattan. He was finally, actually, operationally in Manhattan, and the apartment's modest dimensions and the street's municipal neglect and the gap between where he was standing and where he intended to stand were details, real, noted, filed, rather than facts about his situation. His situation was that he had crossed the borough line. Everything else was a variable. The New York City that absorbed Donald Trump in the early 1970s was a metropolis in the specific and unglamorous process of discovering that the post-war social contract it had offered its residents, the promise of public services, functioning infrastructure, affordable housing, and the general condition of urban life that made density feel like richness rather than deprivation, was fiscally unsustainable at the scale the city had attempted to deliver it. The Lindsay years had expanded municipal employment, social services, and the city's debt obligations simultaneously and in proportions that the tax base could not support. And the combination of middle-class flight to the suburbs, deindustrialization, and the national recession of the early 1970s was compressing that tax base at precisely the moment when the accumulated obligations were coming due. The result was a fiscal situation that city officials described in their public statements with a carefully calibrated ambiguity, acknowledging difficulty while resisting the admission of crisis, and that the bond markets were beginning to evaluate with the dispassionate clarity that financial markets apply to situations where the numbers tell a story that the human beings responsible for them prefer not to narrate. The physical evidence of this fiscal deterioration was everywhere visible in the Manhattan that Trump was studying from his 3rd Avenue window and from the windshield of his car during the reconnaissance drives that had intensified since his formal relocation. The subway system, the infrastructure that organized the physical possibility of the city's density, was operating with a mechanical unreliability and a physical decrepitude that riders absorbed as ambient condition rather than crisis, because the deterioration had been gradual enough to escape the sharp register of sudden change while producing incrementally a system that would have been recognizable to the city's managers of a decade earlier only as a warning about where they were headed. The parks were neglected. The streets were dirty in the specific, systemic way of a city whose sanitation department was engaged in the multi-front labor relations struggle that characterized all of New York's municipal unions during this period. Buildings that had been maintained at a standard compatible with middle-class occupation were declining, visibly and quickly, as the middle-class tenants who had justified that maintenance departed and were replaced by lower-income tenants whose presence the market registered as a signal to reduce investment rather than sustain it. For Donald Trump, who had spent 6 years learning to read distressed properties in the outer boroughs, this landscape was not discouraging. It was, with a specificity that his training had made him capable of recognizing, an opportunity environment, a city whose distress was producing, in the specific locations and property categories where his attention was focused, the combination of motivated sellers, undervalued assets, and municipal desperation for private development partners that constituted, in the vocabulary of real estate acquisition, a buyer's market of historic dimensions. The question was not whether opportunities existed. The question was which ones he could access, finance, and execute, given the resources he had available, and the relationships he had built, and the credibility he had yet to establish in a world whose existing players had every reason to regard a young man from Queens with a modest apartment on 3rd Avenue and a family portfolio in Brooklyn and Flatbush as peripheral to their concerns. The core conflict of Trump's Manhattan relocation period was precisely this credibility gap, the distance between the operator he was and the player he needed to be perceived as in order to access the deals, the financing, and the political relationships that Manhattan-scale development required. In the outer boroughs, Fred Trump's name and operational track record had been sufficient institutional credential. Bankers and city officials and contractors knew what Trump management was and what it could deliver, and this knowledge organized their willingness to engage in terms that the formal financial credentials alone might not have supported. In Manhattan, the Trump name meant nothing. The outer borough portfolio, however substantial by outer borough standards, did not translate into the kind of track record that a midtown banker or a city development official or a major construction lender used to evaluate a potential partner for a project of Manhattan scale. Trump was starting over in the specific sense that mattered most in a business organized around relationships and reputation. He was unknown, which in the world he was attempting to enter was functionally equivalent to unproven, which was functionally equivalent to a risk that established players had no particular incentive to take. His response to this situation was characteristically asymmetric, not the patient relationship-building approach that conventional professional wisdom would have prescribed, not the gradual accumulation of smaller Manhattan deals that would have established a track record on which larger ones could be built, but a direct targeting of the largest, most visible, most institutionally complex opportunity available, on the theory that if the credibility gap was the problem, the solution was a transaction whose scale and prominence would close the gap in a single move rather than across a series of incremental ones. This theory was either brilliant or reckless depending on whether it worked, and the fact that it worked, that Trump's first major Manhattan transaction was not a modest acquisition, but the redevelopment of the Commodore Hotel on 42nd Street, one of the most ambitious and politically complex development deals in the city's recent history, has tended to retroactively classify the theory as brilliant, while obscuring how much of its success depended on contingencies that Trump could not have controlled and that might, in a slightly different configuration of circumstances, have produced a very different outcome. The Commodore project, which would eventually become the Grand Hyatt New York, was in its origins a study in the specific opportunities that New York's fiscal crisis was generating for developers willing to engage with a city government that was, by the mid-1970s, desperate enough for private investment to offer tax arrangements that would have been politically inconceivable in better times. The hotel, which sat on 42nd Street adjacent to Grand Central Terminal, was a deteriorating property in a neighborhood that had become, in the early 1970s, one of the most visibly distressed commercial corridors in the city, a strip of peep shows and discount retailers and vacant storefronts that announced to anyone arriving at Grand Central from the suburbs that the city they were entering was in serious trouble. The hotel itself was losing money. Its owner, Penn Central, was in bankruptcy. The block it occupied was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with the city's commercial core, which meant that any developer who successfully transformed it would inherit, as a form of collateral benefit, a piece of the city's redemption narrative, a story that a city in fiscal crisis badly needed and would therefore support with tools, including tax abatements, that it might otherwise have been reluctant to deploy. The revealing action of Trump's Manhattan entry, the decision that most precisely illuminates the operating character beneath the ambition, was not the Commodore deal itself, which was still several years in the future from his initial relocation, but a specific and smaller transaction that preceded it, and that established the template he would use throughout his career for converting limited resources into maximum leverage. Shortly after establishing himself in Manhattan, Trump identified the option rights to the Penn Central Railroad yards on the west side of Manhattan, an enormous tract of undeveloped land running along the Hudson River, whose potential for residential and commercial development was obvious to anyone who could see past the economic conditions that made its development currently impractical. He did not have the capital to develop the yards. He did not have the relationships, the political access, or the construction financing that development at that scale would require. What he had was the option, the legal right to purchase the property at a specified price within a specified time, which he acquired for a relatively modest payment, and which immediately transformed his position in the Manhattan real estate conversation from that of an interested observer to that of a principal with a stake in one of the most significant development opportunities in the city. He then talked about the West Side yards as though he were already developing them. He mentioned the option in meetings with bankers and city officials and journalists with the same confident specificity he brought to properties he actually owned and operated, describing the development potential, the financing structures he was considering, the political relationships he was cultivating to make the approvals possible. He was not lying exactly. The option was real, the development potential was real, the conversations he was describing were real or in the process of becoming real. But he was performing a version of his position that was several steps ahead of the actual version, presenting himself as a Manhattan developer rather than a Queens developer with a Manhattan option, and doing so with sufficient conviction that the people he was performing for, the bankers and officials and journalists who would eventually be essential to his success, began incrementally to treat him as what he was performing rather than what he was. The figure whose role in Trump's Manhattan transition was most consequential, the relationship that most directly determined whether the transition succeeded or remained an aspiration, was Louise Sunshine, the Democratic fundraiser and political operative who had been moving between Trump's orbit and the city's political world since the late 1960s. Sunshine was, by the early 1970s, one of the most effective political networkers in New York Democratic politics, a person whose value in the city's power ecosystem derived from her ability to identify and connect people whose interests were complementary but who lacked, without her intermediation, the relationship infrastructure to act on their complementarity. She understood, with the professional clarity of someone whose entire career was organized around the currency of access, exactly what Donald Trump needed and exactly which of the relationships in her considerable portfolio could provide it. Through Sunshine, Trump was introduced to the Democratic Party political network that governed the city's development decisions, to the borough politicians and the city council members and the mayoral staffers whose support or opposition would determine whether any large Manhattan development project received the tax treatment, the zoning variances, and the city partnership arrangements that made the economics work. He was introduced as a developer, as someone with capital and ambition and a specific set of projects in mind, and Sunshine's introduction carried the weight of her own credibility. the implicit assurance that this young man from Queens was worth the investment of a conversation, that he was real rather than merely ambitious. This was not a small gift. In a city organized around relationships as the primary currency of institutional access, an introduction from someone whose judgment was trusted by the people whose attention you needed was often the difference between getting in the room and standing outside it. Trump received Sunshine's gift with the combination of genuine gratitude and immediate instrumentalization that characterized his management of all the relationships that were useful to his purposes, valuing them for what they provided, maintaining them with the attentiveness that their value justified, and organizing the entire relational portfolio around the primary question of what each connection could be made to produce. This was not cynicism in the straightforward sense. Trump's relationships during this period were not fraudulent. He delivered value as well as extracted it, provided access and visibility and the reflected energy of his own growing momentum to the people who helped him, creating a network that was genuinely reciprocal in its basic structure, even if the reciprocity was organized around his interests as the central node. By the mid-1970s, as New York's fiscal crisis moved from deterioration to acute emergency, as the city's ability to sell its bonds collapsed, as the state and federal governments negotiated the emergency financing arrangements that would prevent a formal default, as the Daily News ran its famous headline summarizing Gerald Ford's initial refusal to provide federal assistance with the economy of pure tabloid contempt, Donald Trump was positioned through the combination of the West Side option, the Sunshine introductions, and a set of political relationships he had been cultivating with the patient, systematic attentiveness of a man who understood that in New York, politics and real estate were not adjacent industries, but the same industry organized under two different names to make his first genuine move. The Commodore Hotel was sitting at 42nd Street and Lexington Avenue, losing money in a neighborhood that the city's fiscal crisis had reduced to a condition that made its transformation a political as well as a financial imperative. And the young man from Queens who had been studying it from his car window for 2 years was about to walk into the offices of the city's development bureaucracy with a proposal that no one had asked for, and that was, by any conservative assessment of his credentials and his resources, considerably beyond what he had any reasonable right to be offering. He walked in anyway, and the city, desperate, distressed, and entirely out of better options, was, for reasons it would spend the following decades alternately celebrating and regretting, prepared to listen. Chapter 12. Rebranding as the Trump Organization. The telephone in the corner office of the Trump Organization rang before 8 in the morning, and it almost never stopped. Donald Trump had made sure of that. He had arrived at 725 Fifth Avenue, the way he arrived everywhere in those years, ahead of schedule, already in motion, his mind cataloging square footage and lease rates and the names of people who owed him something. The office itself was not yet what it would become. There were no gold fixtures, no oil portraits looming from mahogany paneling, no gallery of magazine covers arranged like hunting trophies along the walls. In the early 1970s, the Trump Organization occupied modest space above Midtown's commercial din, its letterhead newly minted, its ambitions so extravagant, they were almost comic to those who did not yet know to take Donald Trump seriously. He had taken the name from his father's company and sharpened it, stripped away the outer borough associations, the working-class Brooklyn syllables embedded in phrases like Trump management. The new name was clean, corporate, vaguely imperial. It implied a holding company. It implied scale. It implied a man who had already arrived, rather than one who was still climbing, hand over hand, toward the ledge. The year was 1971, and New York City was beginning to come apart at the seams. The fiscal crisis had not yet reached its most grotesque expression. That would come in 1975, when the city hovered so close to municipal bankruptcy that President Gerald Ford's refusal to authorize a federal bailout inspired the most famous headline in tabloid history, but the deterioration was already legible to anyone paying attention. Crime was climbing. Factories were closing. Middle-class families were migrating to the suburbs, in columns so steady they resembled a quiet evacuation. The Bronx burned, not metaphorically but literally, as landlords torched their own buildings for insurance proceeds on blocks that city government could no longer pretend to govern. Brooklyn and Queens, the boroughs where Fred Trump had built his empire of modest brick apartment complexes, were losing their economic scaffolding. The outer boroughs were becoming harder places to make money, at least the kind of money that came without embarrassment, without federal housing inspectors, or tenant advocacy lawyers or newspaper reporters writing about rental discrimination. Fred Trump had navigated that world with the pragmatic ruthlessness of a man who had built something from nothing during the Depression. He understood sewers and zoning boards and the particular arithmetic of working-class rental housing. He was a builder in the most elemental sense, a man who poured concrete and caulked windows and calculated his margins by the number of units and the price of heating oil. Donald had grown up inside that world, had worked its edges since his teenage years, had studied its rhythms at his father's elbow. But he had also grown up feeling, with a certainty that was almost constitutional, that the outer boroughs were a ceiling rather than a foundation. Brooklyn was where you started. Manhattan was where you mattered. The consolidation of the family's assets under the Trump Organization banner was, on its surface, a business decision. In practice, it was something closer to a declaration of identity. Donald was not merely reorganizing a portfolio, he was announcing a trajectory. The Trump Organization would not manage apartments in Flatbush. It would develop hotels and towers and mixed-use complexes in the center of the most famous city in the world. And the name on the buildings would be his name, and the name would eventually become worth more than any individual property beneath it. That logic was not yet proven. It was aspiration dressed in the language of strategy. The particular hurdle he faced in this early period was not, at its root, a problem of financing or zoning or even political access, though all three would require elaborate negotiation. The fundamental obstacle was credibility. Donald Trump was 25 years old, and he wanted to play a game that the established real estate families of Manhattan, the Dursts, the Rudins, the Roses, the Tishmans, had been playing for generations, with inherited capital and institutional relationships that ran deep into the city's banking and political infrastructure. He was the son of a Queens builder, and in the taxonomy of New York real estate, that was a specific and not particularly elevated category. The Manhattan operators looked at the outer boroughs the way Parisians look at the provinces, with a politeness that concealed contempt. He understood this, and his response to it was characteristically bold in its psychology, if not always in its execution. He would not seek entry into that establishment on its own terms. He would manufacture a version of himself that appeared to have already arrived, and he would manufacture it loudly enough, relentlessly enough, that the perception would eventually bend reality to match. This was not a cynical calculation, so much as a deeply held theory of how the world worked. Trump had absorbed, through observation and instinct and the example of his father, the belief that confidence was a form of capital, that projecting certainty created the conditions for certainty to materialize. Fred Trump had taught him that lenders loan money to people who appear not to need it. The lesson his son drew from that principle was expansive and irreversible. If you looked rich, you became rich. If you spoke of your deals as though they were already closed, they had a way of closing. If you stated your ambitions without qualification, without the hedging that careful people use to protect themselves from failure, you moved through the world differently, and the world moved differently around you. The anecdote that best illuminates this quality comes not from a boardroom, but from a lunch table. Sometime in the early 1970s, Trump sought a meeting with Louise Sunshine, a politically connected Democratic fundraiser who was then among the most formidable operators in New York real estate circles. Sunshine had access that Trump did not, access to Governor Hugh Carey's inner circle, to city officials who controlled permits and approvals, and the thousand small decisions that could accelerate or kill a development project. Trump called her office and asked for a meeting. When she arrived, he greeted her with the ease of a man receiving a business associate he had known for years rather than a potential patron he was meeting for the first time. He spoke about his plans for Manhattan, not as proposals but as facts. He described projects not as possibilities but as inevitabilities. He had an uncanny ability, those who met him in this period recalled, to describe his future as though he were narrating his past, as though the towers had already risen, the deals already closed, the profits already counted. Sunshine was not naive. She had been around enough ambitious young men to recognize salesmanship. But she was also practical, and Trump had something real to sell: his father's liquidity, his own relentlessness, and a conviction that the city's distress was not a catastrophe to be mourned, but a market condition to be exploited. While the established families hesitated, paralyzed by the fiscal crisis, by spiraling interest rates, by the specter of a city that could not pay its own employees, Trump was looking for the opportunities hidden inside the collapse. The relationship that solidified during this window was not with Sunshine alone, though she would become a crucial figure in his political navigation of the Carey years. The relationship that shaped the Trump organization's early identity most decisively was the one with Roy Cohn. Cohn had been many things before Donald Trump found him. Chief counsel to Senator Joseph McCarthy during the Army McCarthy hearings, one of the prosecutors in the Julius and Ethel Rosenberg espionage trial, a figure so associated with the darkest currents of mid-century American political life that his name functioned almost as shorthand for a particular species of ruthless, unprincipled power. By the time Trump encountered him at Le Club, a private social establishment on the Upper East Side, in 1973, Cohn was operating as a New York lawyer whose client list functioned as a map of the city's interlocking ambitions: organized crime figures, celebrities, political operators, and now the young scion of a Queens real estate dynasty. Their connection was immediate and, in retrospect, revelatory about both men. Trump was drawn to Cohn's absolute refusal to concede ground, his instinct, honed over decades of the most aggressive legal combat, that any accusation was best answered not with defense but with counterattack. Cohn never apologized, never acknowledged weakness, never allowed an adversary the satisfaction of watching him absorb a blow. He countered. Always. Trump recognized in this posture something compatible with his own deepest temperament, and Cohn recognized in Trump something rare in his experience of ambitious clients: a young man whose appetite for combat matched his appetite for success. The context for their collaboration was immediate and concrete. The Department of Justice had filed a civil suit against Trump management in 1973, alleging that the company had systematically discriminated against black rental applicants in its outer borough properties, refusing applications, misrepresenting availability, steering minority renters away from white majority complexes. The suit was serious. The evidence was documented by federal testers who had posed as prospective renters and recorded the treatment they received from Trump management employees. The government had a case. The conventional response would have been to negotiate a settlement, acknowledge some version of the violation, accept a consent decree, and move on. This was what cautious businessmen did when the federal government came knocking. Roy Cohn was not a cautious man, and he had no interest in making Donald Trump one. Their response was to countersue the Department of Justice for $100 million, claiming prosecutorial misconduct and harassment. The countersuit was dismissed, as Cohn surely knew it would be. But it served its purpose, which was not legal, but psychological and strategic. It signaled to everyone watching, the federal government, the New York real estate community, the press, that Donald Trump did not yield. That he came back harder. That the cost of attacking him was pain. The discrimination case was eventually settled in 1975 with a consent decree that required changes in rental practices but included no admission of wrongdoing. Trump declared victory. Whether the declaration was justified was almost beside the point. He had navigated a federal investigation without being broken by it, had emerged with the Trump Organization's momentum intact, and had forged in the process a working relationship with Roy Cohn that would define his approach to every significant legal and political conflict over the next decade. What the Cohn alliance revealed, beneath its surface drama, was something important about how Trump understood power. He was not, at this stage, ideologically coherent in any traditional sense. He did not arrive at his positions through deliberation or principle, but through instinct and interest. What he believed in, with a consistency that never wavered, was leverage. The point was always to hold more cards than the other side knew you held, to appear stronger than the situation required, to make every negotiation a test of nerve rather than a calculation of facts. Cohn had practiced this art for decades in the most hostile arenas American political life could offer. He was, in this sense, the perfect teacher, not because Trump needed instruction in aggression, but because Cohn provided validation, legal cover, and a methodological sophistication that Trump's raw instincts had not yet developed on their own. The outer borough portfolio continued to generate the cash that funded these ambitions. The brick apartment complexes in Coney Island and Flatbush and the beach communities of Queens may have lacked the glamour of Fifth Avenue, but they produced steady income, and in the fiscal crisis years when Manhattan development had nearly stopped, that income was the platform from which everything else was launched. Trump had not abandoned his father's empire. He was using it as a bank. By the late 1970s, the pieces were assembling themselves with a velocity that surprised even some of the people helping to arrange them. The Grand Hyatt deal, Trump's renovation of the Commodore Hotel near Grand Central Terminal, executed in partnership with the Hyatt Corporation and underwritten by a 40-year tax abatement negotiated with a city so desperate for development that it offered extraordinary concessions, established him as a legitimate Manhattan developer for the first time. The Commodore project, completed in 1980, was not merely a building. It was proof of concept. It proved that Donald Trump could navigate the city's political bureaucracy, could structure complex public-private financing, could deliver a project on a scale that the outer borough portfolio had never required him to attempt. The building that opened on 42nd Street gleamed with mirrored glass in a neighborhood that had spent a decade fading into grime and threat. It gleamed with intention. Trump had wanted it to be impossible to ignore, and it was. People talked about it the way they talked about audacious things, with irritation and admiration in equal measure. His name was on the letterhead now. His name was, increasingly, in the columns. He was giving interviews, accepting invitations, appearing at the parties where deals were discussed over cocktails in apartments above Central Park. He was constructing, alongside the buildings, something less tangible and far more durable, a public self, a persona, a character that would in time outlast any individual project and become, in its own way, the most significant thing he ever built. What no one watching him in those early years of the Trump Organization fully understood was that the persona and the business were not separate enterprises running in parallel. They were the same enterprise. The brand was the leverage. The name was the asset. And as the tower that would bear that name in its largest and most famous expression began to take shape in the architect's drawings, a sleek shaft of dark glass planned for the corner of 5th Avenue and 56th Street, planned to be the tallest residential building in the world. The logic that had animated every decision since the renaming of the company was about to demand its largest test and attract its most dangerous scrutiny. Chapter 13. The Roy Cohn Alliance. Roy Cohn arrived at depositions the way other men arrived at prize fights. He came in already swinging. His briefcase hit the table with the deliberate weight of a man who understood that every gesture in a legal proceeding was also a performance, and that performance was inseparable from outcome. His suits were expensive and slightly rumpled, as though he had slept in them on purpose, as though he wanted opposing counsel to understand that he had been working while they were resting. His eyes, small and perpetually calculating beneath heavy lids, moved around a room the way a card counter's eyes move around a blackjack table, registering everything, discarding nothing, deciding in the first 30 seconds who held power and how much of it could be transferred. He was 50 years old in 1977, already ill with what he would not yet name, already carrying the freight of a reputation so combustible that merely retaining him sent a message to the other side. Donald Trump watched all of this and understood it perfectly. He was 31 when the Cohn alliance moved from personal friendship into full professional engagement, and he had by that point already absorbed enough of Cohn's operating philosophy to recognize it as a more sophisticated version of instincts he had always possessed. What Cohn gave him was not a new way of thinking. It was a language for a way of thinking he had always practiced, an intellectual framework, prosecutorial and merciless, that transformed what might have seemed like mere belligerence into something closer to doctrine. Under Cohn's influence, Trump's natural aggression acquired architecture. The world in which this alliance operated was New York at perhaps its most paradoxical moment. The fiscal crisis of 1975 had humiliated the city in ways that its political class was still processing. The municipal government had lost control of its own finances so completely that a state oversight board, the Municipal Assistance Corporation, quickly nicknamed Big Mac by the tabloids, had assumed effective authority over the city's budget. Layoffs had gutted the police department, the fire department, the sanitation department. Neighborhoods that had once been densely populated and commercially active were becoming hollow. Times Square had descended into a theater of cheap vice that the city's tourism industry could not explain away. The Bronx burned. The subways, covered floor to ceiling in graffiti so comprehensive it had become its own ecosystem, ran on schedules that were suggestions rather than commitments. And yet, and this was the paradox that Trump grasped more quickly than almost anyone operating at his level, the collapse had created conditions that a sufficiently aggressive and sufficiently capitalized developer could exploit with extraordinary efficiency. The city needed investment. The city needed someone to build something beautiful and expensive on a block that had given up on itself. The city needed, in the bluntest possible sense, to be shown that private money still believed in it. And private money, when it arrived in those years, could negotiate terms that would have been unthinkable in a functioning market. Tax abatements, zoning variances, exemptions and deferrals, and favorable assessments. The price of the city's gratitude was low because the city's options were few. Trump moved through this landscape with the confidence of a man who understood distress as opportunity. But opportunity, in the New York of the late 1970s, required protection. The city's bureaucratic and legal apparatus was Byzantine, even in good times. In bad times, when every agency was understaffed and every official was simultaneously under pressure from a dozen competing interests, the process of shepherding a major development through the regulatory system required someone who knew which doors opened from the inside and which could be forced. Roy Cohn knew every door in New York. This was the core of what Trump needed from him, and it went well beyond the formal attorney-client relationship. Cohn's Rolodex was an artifact of decades of triangulation across the city's interlocking power structures, Democratic clubhouses and Republican law firms, organized crime-adjacent businesses, and cathedral fundraising committees, newspaper editors and television producers, and the kind of mid-level city officials whose names never appeared in print but whose signatures appeared on permits. He had defended mob bosses and socialites and politicians, had been present at enough private dinners and back-channel negotiations to understand that the public apparatus of New York was a theater set, and that the actual decisions were made in rooms that did not appear on any organizational chart. Trump's access to those rooms before Cohn had been real but limited. His father had connections in Brooklyn and Queens political circles, had navigated the outer borough Democratic machine with the patience of a man who understood that construction permits moved faster when the right people were taken care of. But the Manhattan game was different in kind, not just degree. The stakes were higher, the players were more sophisticated, and the penalties for miscalculation were more severe. What Cohn provided was not merely legal counsel. He was a social passport, a credibility transfer, a signal to the men who ran New York's shadow infrastructure that Donald Trump had been vetted by someone they respected or feared or both. The primary conflict of this period was not the Justice Department housing discrimination suit, though that case served as the crucible in which the Cohn method was most visibly tested. The deeper conflict was structural. Trump was attempting to establish himself as a major Manhattan developer at precisely the moment when the city's lending institutions, battered by the fiscal crisis, had become extraordinarily conservative about real estate financing. Banks that had once extended credit to developers with modest track records were now demanding established relationships, proven histories of completion, financial statements that could survive intense scrutiny. Trump had his father's assets as collateral, but he lacked the Manhattan portfolio that would have told a skeptical loan committee that he belonged in the same room as the families who had been building on this island for 3 and 4 generations. The Commodore Hotel project, which would become the Grand Hyatt and establish his Manhattan credentials once and for all, required financing so complex that it involved multiple institutions, a partnership with a major hotel corporation, and a tax abatement negotiation with the city that had no real precedent. Assembling that package required political relationships that Trump was still building, and it required someone to manage the legal architecture of a deal whose moving parts could come apart at any point for any number of reasons. Cohn managed it. And in managing it, he demonstrated to Trump a principle that would govern his behavior for the rest of his career: that the line between legal strategy and political maneuvering was not a line at all, but a spectrum, and that the most effective operators moved fluidly along that spectrum without stopping to consult their conscience about which side of it they were on. The keyhole anecdote that opens directly into Trump's character during this period involves not a courtroom or a negotiating table, but a telephone call. In 1978, a journalist at one of the New York tabloids was working on a story about the Commodore project, specifically about the terms of the tax abatement, which critics in the city council were beginning to describe as extravagantly generous to a developer who did not need the city's charity. The reporter had made calls to city officials and was preparing a piece that Trump considered unfair, inaccurate in its characterization of the deal's benefits to him relative to its costs to the public treasury. A careful man, advised by cautious lawyers, would have issued a written statement and declined further comment. Trump picked up the phone himself. He called the reporter directly and spoke for 45 minutes. He did not offer a rebuttal in the traditional sense. He offered a counter-narrative, a version of the Commodore story in which he was not the beneficiary of extraordinary public generosity, but the instrument of the city's salvation, the one developer willing to bet on a block that everyone else had abandoned, the man whose vision and risk tolerance were the only reason Grand Central Terminal would have a neighbor worth looking at. He deployed statistics with the ease of a man who understood that statistics, in a tabloid context, landed not as evidence but as authority, that the specific number stated with conviction was more persuasive than a hedged approximation. He praised the reporter twice during the conversation. He mentioned casually, that he had spoken with the editor the previous week. He ended the call by suggesting that the reporter consider a follow-up piece about the project's anticipated economic benefits for the surrounding neighborhood, and offered to make the relevant research available. The story that ran was measurably softer than the version the reporter had originally envisioned. This was not journalism interference in any crude or illegal sense. It was something more interesting and, in its way, more sophisticated, an intuitive understanding that journalists were not adversaries to be avoided, but instruments to be played. Trump had recognized, earlier than almost any public figure of his generation, outside of pure entertainment celebrities, that the press was not a separate institution operating according to its own logic, but a participant in the same social and economic ecosystem he inhabited. Reporters needed stories. Stories needed protagonists. Protagonists who were accessible, quotable, visually compelling, and willing to deliver a strong declarative sentence on short notice were rare and therefore valuable. He was all of those things, and he used that value the way he used every other form of leverage, constantly, consciously, without sentiment. Cohn had understood this too, had practiced a version of it throughout his career, and the two men reinforced each other's instincts on this point with a completeness that made their media strategy feel less like a tactic than a philosophy. Cohn's specific contribution was to model the counteroffensive, to demonstrate, through his own conduct across decades of legal and political conflict, that the correct response to a damaging story was never retreat and never a measured, qualified denial. The correct response was a louder, more aggressive claim that put the original accuser on the defensive. You did not answer the question. You questioned the questioner. You did not address the allegation. You alleged something worse about the person making it. Trump absorbed this lesson completely. It would prove, over the decades that followed, to be the single most consequential thing Roy Cohn ever gave him. The relationship between the two men during this window was not, by any conventional measure, one of equals. Cohn was the senior figure, the established operator, the man whose reputation preceded every room he entered. But there was a mutuality to their regard that went beyond the transactional. Cohn, who had spent his professional life among men who privately found him useful and publicly found him embarrassing, seemed genuinely to enjoy Trump's company, enjoyed his energy, his lack of irony, his complete absence of the social hesitation that more educated men brought to dealings with someone of Cohn's history. Trump did not find Cohn complicated. He found him effective. And that straightforward appreciation, free of the ambivalence that sophisticated people brought to the Cohn question, seems to have meant something to a man who had been socially radioactive for much of his adult life. Cohn, for his part, operated as something between a lawyer and a godfather in the oldest sense of that word, a sponsor, a protector, a man whose endorsement conferred a kind of legitimacy that no credential or accomplishment could fully replicate. When he appeared alongside Trump at public events, when his name appeared in connection with Trump's business interests, it communicated to the city's power structure that this particular young developer was not to be trifled with in the usual ways. The normal pressure points, regulatory delays, permitting complications, the quiet obstruction that entrenched bureaucracies could apply to outsiders, were less reliable when the outsider had Roy Cohn returning his calls. By 1980, with the Grand Hyatt open and the plans for Trump Tower advancing through the approvals process, Trump had completed the transition that had been the goal since the founding of the Trump Organization. He was a Manhattan developer now, not a Queens builder's son who had crossed the river with ambitions too large for his credentials. The buildings were real. The name was recognizable. The persona was beginning to acquire the self-sustaining momentum of a brand that could exist independently of any individual transaction. The press covered him with a fascination that was already slightly different from the coverage it gave to other developers. Other developers built buildings. Trump, the coverage suggested, was performing something, was staging an argument about New York and ambition and money, and what a man could make himself into if he refused at every moment to accept the ceiling that more cautious people would have called a reasonable expectation. He read every word. He kept the clips. He called reporters to comment on their own stories about him. He sent notes, sometimes congratulatory, sometimes corrective, to columnists who had mentioned him in passing. He understood that the coverage was not a reflection of his success, but a component of it, that the story of Donald Trump was a story he was writing in collaboration with the New York press, and that the most important thing was to keep the story moving forward, to ensure that the next development was always just visible on the horizon, creating the sensation that something larger was always coming. Something larger was always coming. The question that no one was yet asking, not the journalists, not the bankers, not the politicians who had found him useful and assumed they understood the limits of his appetite, was whether the methods that had built the Trump Organization were methods that knew how to stop, or whether they were methods that required by their own internal logic an endlessly expanding theater in which to operate, a stage that would eventually prove too small no matter how many towers rose upon it. Roy Cohn would be dead within a decade, destroyed by a disease he denied having until the morning he could no longer speak. And Trump would say at the funeral that he had never known anyone like him, which was true, and which was, depending on how you read the years that followed, either a tribute or a warning. Chapter 14. The Commodore Hotel Renovation. The Commodore Hotel smelled like defeat. Trump stood on the sidewalk outside its 42nd Street entrance in the winter of 1974 and took in what it had become: the peeling marquee, the lobby visible through smudged glass where transients had replaced the traveling salesmen and theater-bound couples who had once made it one of the busiest hotels in the country. The carpets inside were the color of old bruises. The chandeliers had gone dark in sections, like teeth knocked from a jaw. A few years earlier, the management had stopped pretending the bar was a destination and started pretending it didn't exist. The doormen were gone. The Commodore, which had opened in 1919 adjacent to Grand Central Terminal, and had for decades served as a kind of anteroom to the ambitions of Midtown Manhattan, was running at roughly one-third occupancy and losing money with the reliable efficiency of a municipal agency. The Pennsylvania Railroad, which owned it through a subsidiary, wanted nothing more than to be released from the obligation of its existence. Trump wanted something more complicated than that. He stood on that sidewalk. He would return to it multiple times over the months that followed, always alone or nearly so, always looking up at the facade with the expression of a man who is not seeing what is there but what could replace it, and understood that the building's degradation was not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be leveraged. The Commodore was dying. The city around it was dying. The intersection of those two facts, which most rational observers read as a reason to stay away, was precisely what made the opportunity real. New York, in 1974, was a city that had begun to suspect, with a quiet horror it had not yet fully articulated, that its best years were behind it. The population had been declining for a decade. The manufacturing jobs that had anchored the working-class economy of Brooklyn and Queens and the Bronx were migrating south and west, following cheaper labor and newer infrastructure, leaving behind neighborhoods whose commercial strips looked like mouths with missing teeth. The crime statistics, which the Lindsay administration had spent years contextualizing and reframing, had become impossible to explain away. In 1974, the city recorded more than 1,600 murders. Rape, robbery, and assault were rising in every borough. The subways, whose daily ridership had once been a point of civic pride, were now places that required a particular negotiation between necessity and dread. Tourists were staying away. Conventions were relocating. The office towers of Midtown, which had seemed in the 1960s to represent an inexhaustible appetite for commercial space, were developing vacancy rates that made their owners quietly desperate. And the fiscal architecture that had sustained the city's social contract, the hospitals and libraries and parks and transit systems that had made New York not merely a city, but an argument about what a city could be, was crumbling in the most literal budgetary sense. The city was spending money it did not have, borrowing to cover operating expenses in a spiral that every serious analyst understood was unsustainable, and that the city's political leadership had chosen to manage by pretending it wasn't happening. When the pretending finally ended, in the spring of 1975, the crisis arrived with the force of something that had been building for years behind a wall that everyone had privately known was not going to hold. Trump understood this context, not as a citizen who feared its consequences, but as a developer who was reading its implications for the price of doing business with a desperate city. He was 28 years old, and he was preparing to execute the most complex transaction of his life, a deal whose moving parts would take 4 years to assemble, and whose completion would change the terms on which every subsequent conversation about Donald Trump was conducted. The core obstacle was not architectural or even primarily financial. It was structural in the most fundamental sense. The deal Trump envisioned for the Commodore could not be done by a private developer acting alone. It required the city's active participation, not merely its permission, but its partnership, its willingness to forego tax revenue it desperately needed in order to attract investment it desperately needed more. This was a logical proposition that nonetheless required Trump to persuade people whose institutional incentives ran in the opposite direction. City officials who approved tax abatements were exposed to accusations of favoritism. Bankers who lent money for speculative hotel renovations in a declining market were exposed to accusations of negligence. Partners who committed their brand and their operational expertise to a building in a neighborhood that polite Manhattan had written off were exposed to accusations of poor judgment. Trump had to make all of them believe that what looked like recklessness was actually vision. He had to make them see the building he saw when he stood on that sidewalk, rather than the building that was actually there. The mechanism he devised was elegant in its audacity. He would approach the city not as a supplicant seeking a subsidy, but as a savior offering a rescue. He would frame the transaction not as a developer asking for favorable terms, but as the only available solution to a problem, the dead hotel beside Grand Central, that the city could not afford to leave unsolved. If the Commodore closed entirely, as its owners were threatening, the impact on the surrounding blocks would accelerate a deterioration that was already visible and alarming. Grand Central itself, the architectural cathedral of Midtown, whose landmark status had only recently been confirmed by a Supreme Court case that the city had fought at considerable expense, would be flanked by a derelict hulk. The symbolism alone was devastating. Trump offered to prevent that, but only on terms that reflected the reality that no rational private actor would take this risk without meaningful public participation. The terms he ultimately negotiated, after years of meetings with city officials, the Urban Development Corporation, and the administration of Mayor Abraham Beame, were extraordinary by any measure. The city agreed to purchase the hotel from its owners and simultaneously lease it back to Trump, a maneuver that allowed the property to be removed from the tax rolls and then returned under a 40-year abatement arrangement that would eventually be valued in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The deal was structured so that Trump paid a negotiated payment in lieu of taxes rather than the full assessed rate, and that payment was calculated on terms sufficiently favorable that several city council members, upon reviewing the agreement, used the word scandalous in public statements. Trump's response to those objections was a clinic in the counter-offensive method he had learned from Roy Cohn. He did not defend the terms. He attacked the premise. He said, in interviews and in the conversations that found their way into the newspapers, through the channels he had by then established, that anyone who objected to the abatement was welcome to find another developer willing to take on this risk in this neighborhood at this moment in the city's history. He said it the way a man holds a door open and waits, with the theatrical patience of someone who already knows no one is going to walk through. No one walked through. The deal was approved. The revealing action that cuts most directly to Trump's character during this period involves a single meeting with the Hyatt Corporation in 1975, when the deal was still fragile, and the partnership terms were being negotiated with the kind of granular specificity that could collapse a transaction at any point. Hyatt had agreed, in principle, to operate the renovated hotel under its brand, a commitment that was essential to the financing structure, because lenders who would not loan money on a speculative renovation by an unproven Manhattan developer would consider an entirely different proposition if that developer was partnered with one of the country's established hotel operators. But Hyatt's executives were experienced men who had evaluated hotels across the country, and they were bringing to the Commodore negotiation a thoroughness that Trump found both necessary and threatening. They had questions about the renovation timeline. They had questions about the construction budget. They had questions about the management structure and the equity split and the decision-making authority for operational matters once the hotel was open. Trump answered every question with a certainty that his actual state of knowledge did not fully support. He had not yet secured the financing that would make the renovation possible. He had not yet finalized the city's tax abatement arrangement. He was negotiating with Hyatt as though the deal were already closed at both ends, when in fact it was open at every end simultaneously. When a Hyatt executive asked him what would happen if the city revised its abatement terms, Trump told him that the city would not revise its terms, and he said it with such flat conviction that the executive, who had no reason to doubt him and every reason to want to believe him, wrote it down in his notes as though it were a fact rather than an assertion. It was, in the strictest sense, a form of bluffing. But Trump's relationship to bluffing was more complicated than the word implies. He did not experience himself as misrepresenting reality. He experienced himself as establishing it. He had a genuine belief, difficult to characterize in conventional epistemological terms, that stating a thing with sufficient force made it more likely to be true, that confidence was not merely a negotiating posture but a kind of causal agent. He had seen this work often enough, in enough different contexts, that the feedback loop was self-reinforcing. He stated things. The things happened. The connection, in his internal accounting, was not coincidental. The Hyatt partnership was the key relationship of this chapter, and it evolved during the Commodore negotiation from a transactional arrangement into something more revealing about how Trump structured all of his significant partnerships. He needed Hyatt more than Hyatt needed him. The brand, the operating expertise, the institutional credibility were assets he could not manufacture, and he handled this imbalance by never acknowledging it. In every interaction with Hyatt's leadership, in every public statement about the project, he described the relationship as one between equals who had independently recognized a mutual opportunity. He spoke of Hyatt's involvement not as a condition of his financing, but as a validation of his vision, as confirmation that serious people had looked at the same building he had looked at on 42nd Street and reached the same conclusion about what it could become. Hyatt's executives, for their part, seemed to have understood the dynamic more clearly than Trump's framing suggested, but found it sufficiently harmless, and the potential upside sufficiently real, to proceed without requiring him to revise his account of their relative leverage. This was a pattern that would repeat itself in every major partnership of Trump's business career. He would construct a narrative of the relationship that served his interests. His partners would find the narrative more or less acceptable, and the collaboration would proceed on the terms of the narrative rather than the terms of the underlying reality, sometimes successfully and sometimes not. The Commodore renovation itself, which began in earnest in 1978 following the finalization of all the necessary agreements, was a physical transformation so complete that the building that emerged bore almost no relationship to the one Trump had observed on that winter sidewalk 4 years earlier. The exterior was sheathed in reflective bronze glass that caught the sky and threw it back at pedestrians in a shimmer that was either beautiful or aggressive, depending on the viewer's aesthetic sensibility. The lobby was rebuilt with a waterfall and a glass-enclosed bar and a level of theatrical visual drama that announced, unmistakably, that someone with very specific ideas about glamour had been in charge of every decision. The Grand Hyatt New York opened in September 1980, and it opened to the kind of press coverage that Trump had by then learned to generate with the reliability of a utility. The reviews were not uniformly positive. Architecture critics noted that the glass sheathing had obliterated what had been, beneath the Commodore's years of neglect, a handsome Beaux-Arts facade. The building had been given a facelift that erased the face. But architecture criticism was not the primary audience for the Grand Hyatt's opening, and the reviews that mattered, the business press, the real estate press, the gossip columns that served as the social register of New York's money culture, were enthusiastic in the way that novelty tends to generate enthusiasm before questions of lasting value can be assessed. Trump was 34 years old. He had built a hotel in Manhattan. He had structured a public-private partnership so complex that it had required the participation of the city government, a major hotel corporation, multiple lending institutions, and a political network assembled over years of careful cultivation. He had done it starting from essentially nothing. No Manhattan track record, no established lender relationships, no existing credibility in the market he was entering. He had done it by refusing to accept that the absence of those things was a barrier rather than an inconvenience. The lesson he drew from the Commodore was not a humble one. The lesson was that a sufficiently bold vision, stated with sufficient conviction to sufficient numbers of people in sufficient positions of power, could reshape reality. That the city's desperation was a permanent resource. That deals that looked impossible from the outside could be assembled piece by piece from the inside if you were willing to hold all the pieces in the air simultaneously and trust that they would land in the right configuration. He took that lesson across 57th Street, where on a block of Fifth Avenue that had once housed the Bonwit Teller department store, construction crews were already at work on the foundation of a building that would make the Grand Hyatt look, in retrospect, like a rehearsal. A glass and brass tower that would carry his name in letters 6 feet tall above one of the most trafficked intersections on Earth, and whose construction would introduce into his story a set of complications that no amount of confidence and no amount of Roy Cohn had fully prepared him to manage. Chapter 15. Leveraging Municipal Subsidies. The tax code was, for those who knew how to read it, a second city hidden inside the first. Trump knew how to read it. He sat in the conference room on the upper floor of his Fifth Avenue offices in the spring of 1980 with the relevant sections of the New York City Administrative Code spread across the table in front of him, not because he needed to consult them, but because he had learned from his father and from Roy Cohn and from his own accumulating experience that the physical presence of documents conferred authority in rooms where authority was being contested. The pages were marked in multiple colors. Margins were annotated in a handwriting that moved fast and pressed hard. Across the table sat a pair of attorneys from the city's Department of Housing Preservation and Development, men in their mid-30s who had arrived expecting a routine, preliminary conversation about the applicability of the 421, a tax abatement program, to the residential component of the tower Trump was planning for the corner of Fifth Avenue and 56th Street. They had not expected to find that the developer had done more preparation than they had. They adjusted to this discovery with the careful neutrality of men who understood that showing surprise was a form of concession. Trump let the silence sit for a moment before he spoke. He had learned that too. The 421A program had been created by the New York State Legislature in 1971 as an instrument of precisely the kind of public-private negotiation that the city's fiscal crisis had made necessary and its political culture had made inevitable. The logic was straightforward in conception, if labyrinthine in execution. New residential construction in New York City generated property tax liability that, in a depressed market with high construction costs and uncertain rental demand, made development economically irrational. If the city wanted developers to build housing, and it desperately did, as the population of functioning apartments declined and the cost of existing units climbed, it needed to reduce the tax burden during the period when a new building was being established in the market. The 421A program offered exemptions on the increased assessed value of a newly constructed residential building for periods ranging from 10 to 25 years, depending on the location and the nature of the project. It was, by the standards of tax policy, a blunt instrument. It had been designed with a general problem in mind rather than a specific solution, which meant that its application to particular projects required interpretation, and interpretation required negotiation. And negotiation, as Trump had demonstrated repeatedly since his first dealings with the city over the Commodore, was an environment in which he held structural advantages over opponents who were operating within institutional constraints he did not share. The world in which this negotiation was taking place had shifted in ways that were subtle but meaningful. The worst of the fiscal crisis had passed. The Municipal Assistance Corporation had stabilized the city's immediate debt obligations, and the election of Ed Koch as mayor in 1977 had brought into City Hall an administrator whose instincts were more compatible with private development than his predecessors had been. Koch was not a developer's mayor in the manner of some of the machine politicians who had preceded him. He was too independent, too interested in the sound of his own contrarian voice, too willing to say uncomfortable things in public, but he understood that New York's recovery from the fiscal crisis required private capital, and that private capital required incentives, and that incentives meant making deals with people like Donald Trump. This was the context in which the 421A conversation had become, for Trump, something considerably larger than a routine tax benefit application. The residential floors of Trump Tower, the building that would rise 58 stories above Fifth Avenue and become, in the years following its 1983 completion, the most famous address in New York, represented a financial proposition whose viability was genuinely sensitive to the tax treatment of its condominium units. Trump was planning to sell those units at prices that had no precedent in the Manhattan residential market. The building's commercial floors, anchored by the retail atrium that would become its most architecturally celebrated feature, would anchor the lower structure, but the upper floors, the apartments where celebrities and executives and international money would eventually take up residence, were the project's most speculative component. Their pricing assumed a buyer willing to pay for something more than square footage, a buyer purchasing identity, adjacency to the Trump name, the specific social signal that a Fifth Avenue address at that particular moment in New York's recovery was beginning to transmit. The 421A abatement, if applicable to Trump Tower's residential component, would reduce the carrying costs for those buyers sufficiently to make the purchase calculus measurably more attractive. More importantly, it would allow Trump to price the units at levels that generated the margins he needed, while remaining within a range that the market, still learning what Manhattan luxury residential could command, would accept. The obstacle was definitional, and it was not trivial. The 421A program had been designed with rental housing in mind. Its application to condominium development, to buildings whose units would be sold rather than leased, generating one-time capital transactions rather than ongoing rental income, was legally contested. The city's housing bureaucracy had developed an informal practice of applying the exemption to condominiums in certain circumstances, but that practice had never been fully codified, which meant that each application existed in a space where the answer was negotiable rather than determined. Trump had recognized this ambiguity before anyone in the city's housing department had fully processed its implications for his specific project. He had recognized it because he had spent months with his attorneys examining the program's statutory language and its administrative history, looking for the interpretation that served his interests, and then constructing the argument that made that interpretation seem not merely permissible but obvious. By the time the city's representatives sat across from him in that conference room, he had already decided what the answer was. The meeting's purpose, from his perspective, was not to discover the answer, but to make the city arrive at the answer he had already chosen. The revealing action of this period, the moment that functions as a keyhole into Trump's particular genius for regulatory navigation, involves not the 421 a negotiation directly, but a parallel conversation that was happening simultaneously, and that most observers of the Trump Tower project either did not know about or chose not to examine closely. The building's site on Fifth Avenue had been occupied by the Bonwit Teller department store, whose facade included a pair of decorative limestone bas-relief panels that the Metropolitan Museum of Art had formally requested be preserved and donated to its collection upon the building's demolition. The panels were Art Deco sculptures of genuine aesthetic and historical merit, the kind of artifacts that, in a city with New York's complicated relationship to its own architectural heritage, carried a weight that went beyond their physical dimensions. The Met had made its request through proper channels. The demolition contractor had assured the museum that the panels would be carefully removed and delivered. Trump ordered them destroyed. The explanation he offered afterward was logistical. Removing the panels intact would have required additional time and expense that the construction schedule could not absorb. The calculus was purely practical: a delay of several days and a cost in the low tens of thousands of dollars, set against the momentum of a project whose timeline was already being watched by lenders and partners. He made the decision with the same brisk efficiency he brought to every decision in which sentiment competed with schedule, and he appeared genuinely puzzled by the force of the reaction it generated. The museum was outraged. The architecture community was outraged. The New York Times editorial board, which had been watching the Trump Tower project with the mixture of civic anxiety and grudging acknowledgement that the paper brought to most large midtown developments, wrote about the panel destruction in terms that were notably personal in their disapproval. Trump responded to all of it with the counter-offensive fluency he had developed under Cohn's influence. He questioned the panel's significance, disputed the characterization of his commitment to the museum, and eventually suggested that the critics were more interested in obstructing development than preserving culture. The episode mattered not because of the panels themselves, but because of what it revealed about the hierarchy of values that governed Trump's decision-making when those values came into conflict. Momentum was sovereign. Schedule was a moral category. Anything that slowed the forward motion of a project, regulatory review, historical preservation, institutional courtesy, was an obstacle to be removed by the most efficient means available. And efficiency did not always accommodate the feelings of museums or editorial boards. He was not indifferent to public opinion in a general sense. His entire operating philosophy depended on managing it carefully. But he distinguished between the opinion of audiences he needed and the opinion of audiences he had already discounted, and the Met's curators and the Times's editorial writers fell, in his accounting, into the latter category. They would say what they were going to say. The building would still rise. The key relationship of this chapter was not with Roy Cohn, who remained present and active in Trump's legal affairs, but with a figure who embodied a different kind of institutional access, Abraham Beame, who served as mayor of New York from 1974 to 1977, and whose administration had been the political context for the earliest stages of both the Commodore negotiation and Trump's initial exploration of the 421A program's possibilities. Beame was a small, meticulous man, a former city controller whose understanding of New York's finances was encyclopedic, and whose political instincts had been formed in the Brooklyn Democratic machine that had also shaped Fred Trump's earliest dealings with city government. He was, in other words, a man from Trump's father's world, and Trump had cultivated him with the same combination of respect and calculation that he applied to every relationship where deference served a strategic purpose. Beame had been politically destroyed by the fiscal crisis, had been mayor when the city came closest to insolvency, had been the face of an administration that had misrepresented the city's financial position for years before the truth became undeniable. He left office in 1977, diminished in ways that were not entirely reversible. But his relationships within the city's bureaucratic apparatus survived his departure from elected office, and Trump maintained those relationships with the patient attention of a man who understood that influence, like real estate, retained value longer than the market sometimes suggested. The 421 a negotiation was ultimately resolved in Trump's favor. The city determined that the program's residential exemption applied to Trump Tower's condominium units, a determination that would generate tax benefits over the life of the abatement period that critics later calculated had cost the city tens of millions of dollars in foregone revenue. The determination was legally defensible, the program's ambiguity was real, and reasonable interpretations could support the outcome, but it was also the product of a negotiating process in which one side had done considerably more preparation than the other, had arrived with a conclusion already decided, and had proceeded to construct the evidentiary path from premise to that conclusion with a rigor that made the conclusion appear inevitable. When the abatement was announced, Trump spoke about it in interviews as a straightforward application of an existing program to a qualifying project, as though the outcome had been determined by the facts rather than by the quality of his advocacy. This was not dishonesty in any simple sense. He genuinely experienced the two things as equivalent. The facts were what you made of them. The outcome was what you argued for. The distinction between discovering a result and engineering one had never been in his internal accounting, a distinction that required maintaining. The broader significance of the 421A episode was not merely financial, though the financial significance was real and large. It established a template for Trump's relationship with public subsidy programs that would govern his behavior for the remainder of his career in New York real estate. The template was not, despite the characterizations of critics who found in it evidence of hypocrisy from a man who publicly celebrated free markets, a simple story of a developer gaming a system for private gain. It was something more interesting, a consistent, principled belief that the developer's interest and the public interest were identical, that a building rising on Fifth Avenue or 42nd Street was good for New York in ways that justified whatever public contribution had made it possible, and that anyone who challenged that equation was either confused about economics or motivated by politics. This belief was self-serving in the most literal sense. It served Trump's self, but it was not cynically held. He believed it the way he believed most things about himself, completely without the internal audit that more reflective people apply to conclusions that happen to benefit them. The 421A abatement had helped Trump Tower get built. Trump Tower was good for New York. Therefore, the abatement had been good for New York. The syllogism was airtight inside the epistemological system that governed his reasoning, and he applied it forward into every subsequent negotiation with the same serene confidence that the city's need for what he was building would always justify the terms he required to build it. Trump Tower would open in 1983 to exactly the kind of celebrity and fanfare and critical ambivalence that Trump had become skilled at generating and absorbing simultaneously. The gold and marble atrium would become a destination. The address would become a brand. The name in block letters across the facade would become, for a generation of New Yorkers, and eventually for a much larger audience, the most legible symbol of a particular idea about success, gaudy, unapologetic, impossible to look away from. But even as the building's upper floors were being finished, and its first residents were taking possession of apartments priced at levels that had required a new vocabulary for Manhattan real estate, the methods that had assembled the project, the regulatory maneuvering, the public subsidy extraction, the construction decisions made at the speed of a man who believed momentum was its own justification, were generating a set of consequences that had not yet fully materialized, including a lawsuit filed by workers on the demolition crew, undocumented Polish immigrants who had been paid less than union scale to clear the Bonwit Teller site in conditions that would eventually become the subject of litigation lasting nearly a decade, and whose existence Trump would deny knowing anything about in a deposition delivered under oath. Chapter 16. Domestic and Branding Partnership. She entered a room the way a cold front enters a city. You felt the change in pressure before you saw the cause. Ivana Zelníčková was 28 years old when Donald Trump encountered her in New York in 1976, and she carried herself with the particular self-possession of someone who had already survived one life before beginning another. She had grown up in Zlín, a Czechoslovakian industrial city in the Moravian region, the daughter of an electrical engineer who had understood early that his daughter's athletic gifts were her most negotiable asset in a country where the state controlled most other forms of social mobility. She had skied competitively, at a level that brushed the edges of Olympic consideration. She had married an Austrian citizen named Alfred Winkelmeyer, a marriage of convenience she would later acknowledge, designed primarily to secure a Western passport and the freedom of movement that Czechoslovak citizenship did not provide. She had arrived in Canada, then in New York, moving with the fluid intentionality of someone who understood that geography was a variable, not a fixed condition, and that the right city at the right moment could function as a kind of leverage. Trump encountered her at a restaurant. Accounts differ on which one, a discrepancy he never seemed particularly interested in resolving, and his attention, by all available testimony, was immediate and total. He was not a man who concealed interest. He stared. He approached. He installed himself in the conversation with the territorial confidence of someone who had not yet encountered a room he was not willing to claim. What he saw across that table was a woman who was not going to be easily claimed, and this distinction in the taxonomy of his attraction was not a deterrent but a condition. Trump in 1976 was a man in the process of becoming, not yet the tabloid fixture he would be by the early 1980s, not yet the name above the door of the most famous building in New York, but visibly in transit toward something larger than his current position. He was 30 years old, unmarried, working out of offices that reflected ambition rather than accomplishment, carrying the outline of a persona that had not yet been fully inhabited. His social life in those years was active in the way that young men with money and appetite make their social lives active. Dinners, parties, the particular circuit of establishments and events that in New York served simultaneously as entertainment and networking, as pleasure and as positioning. The cultural moment was one of extraordinary flux in the relationship between public ambition and private display. The 1970s in New York were, among other things, a decade in which the performance of success had become its own industry. Studio 54, had opened in 1977 and immediately established itself as the most visible theater of the city's money culture, a place where celebrity and wealth and beauty were sorted by the velvet rope into a hierarchy so explicit it made the class system look subtle. The tabloids, led by the Post under Rupert Murdoch's ownership after 1976, had transformed the coverage of New York's social elite from the genteel discretion of the society columns into something raw and more democratic in its appetite. A daily theater of access and exposure that required protagonists willing to be seen. Trump was willing. He was more than willing. He had understood the tabloid economy before most of his peers in the real estate world had registered its existence, and he had begun to feed it with the systematic regularity of a man running a supply chain. But a man who appeared alone at these events, however often his name appeared in the columns, was a man whose story lacked a crucial element. The narrative of ascent in New York's social and business culture in this period required a partner, not merely a companion, but a figure who completed and amplified the protagonist's image, who made the story legible to the audiences that mattered. This was the context in which the marriage to Ivana must be understood, not to reduce it to cynicism, which would be both unfair and inaccurate, but to recognize that it operated simultaneously on multiple registers, and that Trump was constitutionally incapable of separating personal desire from strategic advantage even in the most intimate decisions of his life. He wanted Ivana. He also needed what she represented. The two things were not in conflict. They were, in his experience of himself, the same thing. The core obstacle to the marriage, the hurdle this chapter must examine, was not romantic but architectural. Trump was building a version of himself that required every element to reinforce every other element. The tower under construction on Fifth Avenue was a statement about taste and scale and the audacity of appetite. The offices on the floors above Midtown were a statement about seriousness and access. The relationships with Cohn and with the city's political infrastructure were statements about power. What was missing, and what he understood was missing with the same intuitive clarity he brought to the assessment of undervalued real estate, was a domestic counterpart, a private life that could at selective moments be made semi-public in ways that completed the image rather than complicated it. Ivana was almost implausibly well suited to this role, but her suitability was not passive or decorative. She was intelligent in a way that was immediately legible, not the soft intelligence of someone who had cultivated charm as a substitute for substance, but the hard, specific intelligence of a woman who had navigated a communist bureaucracy, a strategic marriage, an immigration process, and a modeling career in a foreign language, and had emerged from all of it with her sense of herself intact. She had opinions. She expressed them. She pushed back. For Trump, who had grown up watching his mother occupy a domestic role that was devoted and warm but carefully subordinate, and who had absorbed from his father's example a model of marriage in which the husband's authority was structural and unquestioned, Ivana represented something genuinely novel, a partner whose independence was visible, whose competence was undeniable, and whose willingness to challenge him was, at least in these early years, a source of stimulation rather than threat. They were married in April 1977 at the Marble Collegiate Church on Fifth Avenue, where the Reverend Norman Vincent Peale, author of The Power of Positive Thinking, a book that Fred Trump had kept in the house and that Donald had absorbed as something close to a personal scripture, officiated the ceremony. The choice of Peale was not incidental. He had married Fred and married Trump. He represented a continuity, a patriarchal endorsement of the new union in the most literal available form. For a man as attentive to symbolism as Trump, the selection of the officiant was as deliberate as any other decision in the staging of a public event. The anecdote that cuts most directly to Trump's character in the context of this marriage, and that functions as the keyhole this chapter requires, did not occur at the wedding or in the early romantic period, but some years later, when Ivana had taken on a substantive operational role in the Trump Organization and had demonstrated, to the surprise of observers who had initially categorized her as a decorative appendage to her husband's ambition, a genuine talent for management. Trump had given her the Plaza Hotel to run, not in the titular sense of an honorary position, but in the operational sense of actual authority over one of the most complex hospitality enterprises in the country. She managed it with a ferocity that her staff found simultaneously admirable and terrifying, an attention to detail so comprehensive that it extended to the thread count of the linens and the precise placement of the flower arrangements in the lobby, a willingness to work hours that exhausted people half her age, a management philosophy that was demanding in the same register as her husband's, and therefore compatible with the culture he had established across the Trump Organization. What the episode reveals is not simply that Ivana was capable, that was evident from the results, but that Trump's decision to give her genuine authority was a form of trust he extended to almost no one who was not named Trump, and that even within the marriage, the extension of that trust was inseparable from the logic of the brand. If Ivana ran the Plaza well, the Plaza reflected well on the Trump name, which reflected well on Donald, which advanced the enterprise that was in some fundamental sense indistinguishable from the marriage itself. The personal and the professional were not compartments he kept separate. They were floors in the same building, connected by the same elevator. The relationship that matters most in this chapter, and whose evolution between the late 1970s and the early 1980s reveals the most about both participants, is the marriage itself, not as a romantic narrative, but as a working partnership that was reshaping both people as it developed. Ivana was changing in ways that Trump had initially encouraged, and would eventually find more complicated than he had anticipated. She was becoming, through her operational role in the Trump Organization, and through her own considerable appetite for public visibility, a figure in her own right, someone whose name appeared in the columns not merely as the developer's wife, but as a personality with her own aesthetic, her own opinions, her own story. She decorated. She redesigned. She moved through the Trump properties, the Palm Beach estate at Mar-a-Lago, purchased in 1985, the apartments above Trump Tower, the Plaza, with a proprietorial confidence that was absolutely genuine and absolutely her own. She wore clothes that occupied the same visual register as the buildings, grand, emphatic, impossible to overlook. She gave interviews. She expressed views. She was, by the early 1980s, a celebrity in the specific New York sense of that word. Someone whose existence had become interesting to a large audience not because of a single achievement, but because of the cumulative impression of a life being lived at an unusual pitch. Trump had wanted a partner who amplified his image. He had found one who was developing an image of her own. For the moment, the two images reinforced each other, and the marriage was, by the available evidence, which includes the testimony of people who knew them both in this period, a genuine partnership, occasionally contentious in the way that partnerships between two willful and competitive people tend to be contentious, but functional and in its own way productive. They built things together. They raised children, Donald Jr., born in 1977, Ivanka, born in 1981, Eric, born in 1984, with a style that reflected both parents, mixing the warmth of regular family presence with the particular demands of parents for whom excellence was the baseline expectation rather than the aspirational ceiling. The home they occupied above Trump Tower was itself a statement, a triplex apartment that Ivana had designed in a style that critics described with varying degrees of diplomacy as Baroque, and that Trump described as beautiful, and that was in any case impossible to look at neutrally. Marble columns and gold leaf, and frescoed ceilings, and furniture of such elaborate ornamentation that the rooms looked less like places people lived than like places people performed the act of living. It was the interior equivalent of the building's facade. Unapologetic, theatrically opulent, designed not to soothe but to impress. That the apartment reflected both of them was significant. Ivana had designed it, but Trump had wanted it. The aesthetic was a collaboration, and the collaboration was a microcosm of the marriage. Two people with complementary appetites and compatible ambitions, building something together that neither could have built alone, in a space where the line between partnership and performance was not always clear and was not always meant to be. What neither of them could see from inside those gilded rooms, in the years when the tower was new, and the money was abundant, and the tabloids were enthusiastic, and the future seemed to be simply a larger version of the present, was the specific and predictable way that the marriage's structural tensions, the competition between two people who both needed to be the most important person in the room, the pressure applied by a public life on a private one, the particular vulnerability of a relationship that had been partly constructed as a brand would eventually express themselves. The name Marla would not appear in the gossip columns for several more years, but the conditions that would make its appearance inevitable were already present in the architecture of a marriage that had been built, like everything else Trump constructed, to project an image of permanence while resting on a foundation whose load-bearing capacity had never been fully tested. Chapter 17. Groundbreaking at Fifth Avenue. The hole in the ground was the most expensive thing Donald Trump had ever owned. He stood at the perimeter of the excavation on a February morning in 1980 and looked down into it with the satisfaction of a man who has converted an abstraction into a fact. The pit was enormous, deeper than it needed to be for a conventional structure, because the building above it was not going to be a conventional structure, and its walls were shored with steel and timber in the provisional way of all construction sites, everything temporary and essential simultaneously. The city's bedrock, exposed for the first time in decades to light and air, and the appraising gaze of a developer who had spent 5 years assembling the conditions that made this particular hole in this particular block of Fifth Avenue possible. Steam rose from the exposed earth in the February cold. The noise of the surrounding city, the cabs on Fifth Avenue, the pedestrian traffic on 56th Street, the ambient mechanical hum of Midtown going about its business, pressed against the edges of the site and was absorbed by it, swallowed into the specific silence that large construction excavations generate at their center. Trump did not look down into that hole with relief. He looked down with appetite. Relief would have implied that the 5 years of negotiation and maneuvering and legal argumentation that had preceded this morning were a burden he was glad to have put down. They were not a burden. They were, in his experience of them, the most interesting 5 years of his professional life to that point. 5 years during which he had been required to operate simultaneously in the legal, political, financial, architectural, and public relations domains, holding all the pieces in the air at once, never allowing any single thread to go slack while attending to the others. The excavation meant that the holding was over. The building was beginning. And the building, once begun, would answer every question that the preceding years had posed about whether Donald Trump belonged in the company of the men who had made Manhattan's skyline. The address, 725 Fifth Avenue, had been his since he optioned the Bonwit Teller site in 1975, but the option had not been the hard part. The hard part was everything between the option and the whole. The zoning variances, the air rights negotiations, the architectural design process, the financing structure, the demolition that had generated its own controversy, and above all the specific and protracted battle to secure the right to build at the height and density that would make the project financially viable and visually transformative rather than merely tall and expensive. The city he was building in had changed texture since the deepest trough of the fiscal crisis, but the change was uneven and its permanence was not guaranteed. Ed Koch's administration had brought a more development-friendly disposition to City Hall than the Lindsay years had permitted, and the private capital that had fled New York in the middle 1970s was beginning cautiously to return. Real estate prices in Midtown were recovering. The office market was tightening. The sense that New York was a fundamentally finished city, that its best commercial real estate had already been built, and that the future held only maintenance and decline, was giving way slowly and without fanfare to something more tentative and hopeful. The city was not yet confident in its recovery, but it was beginning to permit itself the possibility of confidence, which was a different and more interesting condition, because it meant that audacious projects could find financing from institutions that had recently been refusing to consider them. Trump had timed this correctly, as he would time several subsequent cycles, with the instinct of a man who reads markets not through data but through atmosphere, who understands that the most important signal in any real estate environment is the mood of the people making decisions, and that mood is legible to someone paying close enough attention to the right faces in the right rooms. The zoning situation at Fifth Avenue and 56th Street was, however, not a question of mood. It was a question of mathematics and law, and the mathematics were initially hostile. New York City's zoning resolution governs, with a precision that rewards obsessive study, the relationship between a building's footprint, its height, and its relationship to the street. The system uses a metric called the floor area ratio, the ratio of a building's total floor area to the area of the lot on which it sits, to limit density and protect the light and air that the city's streets require to remain habitable. A standard midtown commercial zone might permit an FAR of 15, meaning that a building could contain 15 times the square footage of its lot. To build taller or denser, a developer needed either to acquire additional air rights from neighboring properties or to negotiate zoning bonuses that the city offered in exchange for publicly beneficial features, arcade space, public plazas, retail continuity along street frontages. Trump wanted to build a tower that would be, when complete, the tallest residential building in the world. He wanted 58 stories. He wanted apartments above the 32nd floor, with views that would justify prices the Manhattan residential market had never previously attempted. He wanted a facade of dark bronze glass that would be visible from the park and from the approaches to Midtown, and from the windows of every competing building in a 12-block radius. None of this was possible at the FAR that the Fifth Avenue site permitted, as of right. The air rights solution was the key, and pursuing it required Trump to engage in a negotiation that was simultaneously a real estate transaction, a legal proceeding, a political exercise, and a test of personal relationships with neighboring property owners who had no structural incentive to cooperate with a developer whose project would change their relationship to the sky above them. Air rights in New York. The theoretical development potential of the space above an existing building can be transferred between adjacent or nearby properties under specific circumstances defined by the zoning resolution. If Trump could acquire the unused development rights above the buildings surrounding the Fifth Avenue site, he could stack those rights onto his own FAR and justify the height he required. The Tiffany & Company building occupied the corner immediately adjacent to his site, on the south side of 57th Street. Tiffany had air rights it was not using. Its low, elegant structure sat well below the height that its lot could theoretically support, and Trump wanted them. The negotiation with Tiffany was conducted with a delicacy that Trump did not always bring to transactions where he held the leverage, but deployed readily when the other party held it. Tiffany did not need to sell. Tiffany had occupied that corner since 1940, in a building that had become one of the most recognizable retail addresses on earth, and the company's leadership was not, in the conventional sense, motivated by the opportunity to monetize an intangible asset that had never appeared on any balance sheet. They were motivated by the question of what Trump's tower would do to their neighbor, its shadow, its traffic, its aesthetic relationship to a jeweler whose brand was built on the proposition that understatement was a form of luxury. The core conflict of the air rights negotiation was therefore not financial but aesthetic and reputational. Tiffany's reluctance was not about the price of the rights. Trump could pay what was necessary, but about the design of the building that would rise above them. A tower that was vulgar, that clashed with the refined commercial fabric of Upper Fifth Avenue, that announced itself with the visual aggression of a man who had never understood the difference between expensive and tasteful. Such a tower would damage Tiffany in ways that no transfer payment could compensate. Trump understood this. His response to it constitutes the revealing action that this chapter requires. He hired Der Scott. The architect who would design Trump Tower was not, in the hierarchy of the profession, an establishment figure. Scott was a talented and commercially sophisticated practitioner, whose work demonstrated a genuine understanding of how glass and geometry could generate drama at the scale of Midtown Manhattan. He was not Roche or Pelly or any of the architects whose names carried automatic institutional weight with the boards and communities that evaluated major New York developments. He was exactly the kind of architect Trump needed, someone who could produce a building of genuine visual distinction without requiring the developer to submit to the authority of an aesthetic philosophy that might conflict with his own preferences, which were strong and specific and not easily subordinated to anyone else's professional judgment. What Scott produced, the cascading setback facade of dark bronze mirrored glass that would define Trump Tower's silhouette, was not an accident of collaboration. It was the result of a design process in which Trump was more actively and specifically involved than most developers of comparable projects, a process in which he pushed for the mirrored glass over alternatives that Scott and other architects in the conversation considered more refined, insisted on the setbacks that gave the building its distinctive jagged profile, and made the decision that the atrium, the 6-story retail galleria at the building's base, would be clad in warm orange-veined marble and brass in quantities that were, by any conventional measure of commercial design, excessive. The design was the argument. The building's visual language declared, as explicitly as an architectural statement can, that the man who had commissioned it was not interested in the approval of people who equated restraint with sophistication. He was interested in impact. The tower would not whisper its presence. It would announce itself from every approach as something that had not existed before and that could not be overlooked now that it did. Tiffany, presented with the Scott designs and with Trump's assurances about the atrium's retail character and the building's likely tenants, eventually agreed to the air rights transfer. The negotiation had taken months and had required Trump to make commitments about the building's ground floor retail environment that he was more or less willing to honor, and that served his interests in any case, since a luxury retail base enhanced the residential units above it. The agreement was presented publicly as a demonstration of neighborhood compatibility, as evidence that Trump Tower belonged on this block, among these neighbors, in this particular section of the avenue that ran from the park to the plaza, and defined in the imagination of the world what New York meant when it meant money. The key figure in this chapter's supporting narrative is not an individual but an institution, the New York City Planning Commission, whose approval of the tower's zoning variances represented the culmination of a political effort that had engaged virtually every relationship Trump had built in the preceding decade. The commission was staffed by mayoral appointees who operated within a formal regulatory framework, but who were not immune to the political context in which they functioned. And that context, in Coke's New York, in the early years of the city's recovery, in a moment when private development was being celebrated rather than scrutinized, ran in Trump's direction. He had cultivated the relevant commissioners not through improper means, but through the more diffuse and entirely legal form of influence that consists of being present in the right rooms at the right times, of being known as a developer who delivered, who completed projects on schedule, who produced buildings that generated tax revenue and employed construction workers, and gave the city something to point to when it needed evidence that private investment still believed in New York. The Grand Hyatt was open. It was full. It was proof. And proof, in the regulatory environment of 1979 and 1980, was the most persuasive argument available. The variances were approved. The air rights were transferred. The excavation proceeded. Standing at the edge of that hole on the February morning, when the full depth of the foundation had been reached, Trump was already doing in his mind what he always did at the moment of physical groundbreaking. He was not looking at what was there, but at what would be there, was running the finished building against the sky in his imagination with the practiced ease of a man who has spent years developing the ability to see the future in a pit of frozen earth. The tower in his mind was complete, the glass gleaming, the name and letters across the facade, the lobby full of people moving through Italian marble and brass, and the specific golden light that the atrium design was calculated to produce. What he could not see from the edge of that excavation was the subterranean dimension of what the digging had already disturbed. The workers who had cleared the site in conditions that were already generating legal claims in offices across Lower Manhattan, the lawsuits gathering in the dark below the line of public visibility, the documentation being assembled by attorneys representing men who had worked the night shift in the cold and had not been paid what they were owed and who would not go away simply because the building above their grievances was rising toward the sky and bearing the name of a man who had decided some months earlier that he had not been present and had not known what was happening and could not therefore be held responsible for any of it. The tower rose. The claims rose with it. And the question of which would reach its full height first was one that the courts, rather than any zoning board, would eventually be required to answer. Chapter 18. The Construction of Trump Tower. The marble arrived from a quarry in the Apuan Alps, in blocks so large they required specialized rigging to move. Trump watched the first shipment come off the truck on 56th Street with the attention of a man receiving something he has been imagining for a long time. The stone was breccia pernis, a rose-veined Italian marble whose warm amber-pink coloration fell somewhere between sunset and cognac, a stone that the quarry's representatives had brought samples of to the Trump offices months earlier, spreading slabs across the conference table like a geological card trick. Trump had picked this one immediately, without the prolonged deliberation that his architects had anticipated. He had held the sample in both hands, turned it toward the window where the Fifth Avenue light caught the veining, and said that this was it, that this was the stone, that he wanted it everywhere, on the floors, on the walls, on the elevator surrounds, on every vertical and horizontal surface in the atrium that could physically receive it, and that he wanted enough of it that when people walked into Trump Tower, they would understand, before they had read a single word of marketing copy or spoken to a single salesperson, that they were somewhere that had been built without compromise. The architects exchanged a glance. The quantity he was describing was not, by any conventional standard of commercial interior design, a quantity that was considered. It was a quantity that was insisted upon. There is a difference, and it runs through every significant decision in the construction of Trump Tower like the veining runs through the marble itself. The building was rising through the winter and spring of 1981 with the controlled urgency of a project whose timeline was both financial and theatrical. Every floor completed was a floor that could be photographed, that could be shown to prospective buyers who were being asked to make purchasing decisions based on architects' renderings and scale models, and the developer's own verbal descriptions of what the finished apartments would feel like from the inside. Trump had been selling units before the concrete was cured, before the glass curtain wall had reached the 20th floor, before any of the interiors existed in any form except his own vivid and specific imagination. He was selling the idea of the building, the identity it would confer, the statement it would make on behalf of anyone whose name appeared on a deed above the 30th floor. And he was selling it, by all available measures, successfully. The New York into which Trump Tower was rising in 1981 was a city in the early stages of a transformation whose full scope would not be legible for another decade, but whose outlines were already visible to anyone watching the right indicators. The fiscal crisis had bottomed. The municipal government was, if not flourishing, at least solvent in a way it had not been 5 years earlier. The financial sector, the banks and brokerages and investment firms that clustered in Lower Manhattan and increasingly in Midtown, was beginning the expansion that would accelerate through the decade and make Wall Street the dominant economic force in a city that had previously distributed its prosperity more broadly. Money was returning to New York, and it was returning in a specific form, concentrated, unapologetically conspicuous, impatient with the restraint that earlier generations of the wealthy had practiced as a social obligation. The culture was shifting in ways that made Trump's aesthetic instincts, his conviction that luxury should announce itself, that opulence was not a vice to be moderated but a virtue to be displayed, suddenly, almost eerily, contemporary. Ronald Reagan had been elected in November 1980 on a platform that reframed private wealth as evidence of virtue rather than a condition requiring justification. The cultural deference to restraint that had governed the presentation of affluence through most of the 1970s, a decade in which even genuine wealth had been costumed in denim and earth tones, and the social grammar of egalitarianism was giving way with remarkable speed to something brasher and more comfortable with its own excess. Dynasty premiered in 1981. The shoulder pads got wider. The lifestyles of the rich and famous would begin broadcasting in 1984, and it would film more than once in the lobby that the Breccia Pernis was currently being laid to receive. Trump had not created this cultural moment, but he had, through some combination of instinct and luck and the self-reinforcing logic of a man who had always believed in his own vision, positioned himself to be its most legible emblem. The core conflict of the construction period was not architectural. Der Schutt's design was largely settled by the time the steel began to rise, but commercial and psychological, and it was more serious than the public chronicle of the building's progress suggested at the time. Trump Tower was being built on a financing structure that required the condominium sales to proceed at a pace and a price point that had no precedent in the Manhattan residential market. The apartments were priced at levels that assumed a buyer pool that had not yet demonstrably materialized, international money, entertainment figures, executives for whom the act of purchasing at this address was itself the point. If the sales velocity slowed, if the market reacted to the prices with the skepticism that more cautious observers had privately predicted, the entire financial architecture of the project would be exposed to pressures that its construction loan could not indefinitely absorb. Trump was aware of this. He managed the awareness the way he managed most sources of anxiety, by converting it into energy, into an acceleration of effort, into a marketing campaign whose intensity and creativity were in direct proportion to the stakes involved. He placed advertisements in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal that did not describe the building so much as declare it. The copy did not hedge. It did not offer the measured language of a real estate developer who wants to interest you in a property. It offered the absolute language of a man who wants you to understand that you are being offered access to something that will not be available indefinitely, something that the people who matter have already recognized as significant, something whose value will be legible to everyone who sees your address on an envelope. The advertisements were written in a register that borrowed from fashion and from luxury goods marketing rather than from conventional real estate copy, and their effect was to position Trump Tower not as a residential building but as a membership in a category. The revealing action that opens most directly into Trump's character during this construction period occurred not in a marketing session or a financing meeting, but on the construction site itself, in the interior floors where the apartment finishes were being determined unit by unit. Trump made regular visits to the building as construction progressed, not the ceremonial walkthroughs that developers schedule for photographs, but working visits in which he moved through the unfinished floors with a superintendent and a set of drawings, and the particular focused attention of a man who understands that the difference between a building that becomes legendary and a building that merely becomes expensive is located in decisions that most developers delegate to subordinates. He checked ceiling heights. He checked the marble installation on the elevator cabs, running his hand along the joints to assess the quality of the setting. He checked window alignments and the positioning of light fixtures and the radius of curved wall sections in the lobby that had to be executed with a precision the marble's veining would expose if the work was sloppy. On one visit, sometime in the spring of 1982, he encountered a section of atrium wall where the marble installation had been completed, but where the veining in the stone did not align across the seams between panels in the manner he had specified. The misalignment was subtle, the kind of detail that the vast majority of people who would eventually walk through that atrium would not consciously register. Trump registered it immediately. He stood in front of the wall for a long moment, and then told the superintendent that the panels needed to come down and be reinstalled. The superintendent, a veteran of large commercial projects, who had spent his career managing the gap between design intent and construction reality, explained that removing and reinstalling the panels would cost a significant sum and add days to the interior finish schedule. Trump told him to do it anyway. The exchange was reported by people who witnessed it, and it was reported not as an example of unreasonable perfectionism, but as evidence of a coherence between the building's stated ambitions and the standards being applied in its execution. Trump was not demanding the realignment because he was difficult. He was demanding it because he understood, with an architectural intelligence that his detractors consistently underestimated, that a luxury building's credibility is established in precisely these moments, that the buyers paying the prices he was asking were people whose experience of quality was sufficiently developed that they would feel the difference between a building that had been finished to its own standard and a building that had negotiated with its own standard when the standard became inconvenient. The marble went back up correctly. The wall was right. The key figure in this chapter's supporting narrative is the architect der Stadt, and what the construction period reveals about that relationship illuminates something essential about how Trump understood collaboration. Scott had designed a building of genuine visual power. The cascading bronze glass setbacks, the asymmetrical profile that gave the tower a dynamic quality, unusual in a building of its period, the decision to break the curtain wall into angled facets that caught light differently at different hours of the day. These were real architectural achievements, and Trump acknowledged them in the early stages of the project with a directness that genuine enthusiasm produced in him. But as the building rose and the public attention intensified, Trump's characterizations of the design began to shift in a direction that Scott and those close to him found difficult to accept with equanimity. In interviews, and there were many interviews, because Trump was feeding the press with a regularity that the press had come to expect and rely upon, he spoke of the design choices as though they had originated with him, as though the bronze glass and the setbacks and the atrium configuration had been his specifications that the architect had executed rather than the architect's conceptions that he had approved. He did not explicitly deny Scott's authorship. He simply crowded it out, filling the available space in the public account with his own presence until the architect's contribution, while never formally erased, became difficult to locate in the narrative. This was not malice. It was a pattern so deeply embedded in Trump's self-conception that it operated below the level of deliberate distortion. He genuinely experienced his involvement in the design process as creative rather than curatorial, genuinely believed that his preferences and decisions had shaped the building in ways that made his authorship legitimate. The line between selecting the marble and conceiving the marble, between approving the setbacks and inventing them, was a line that his internal accounting did not reliably maintain. Scott remained professionally associated with the project and received his credit in the architectural press, which cared about attribution in ways the tabloids did not. But the relationship's warmth cooled in the building's final construction year, and the cooling was the specific temperature of a collaboration in which one party has discovered that the other's need to be the primary figure in every story will eventually consume even the stories that belong to someone else. By the fall of 1982, with the building approaching its topping out and the interior finishes progressing floor by floor, the sales numbers had begun to validate the premise that the skeptics had questioned. The prices were holding. The international buyers had materialized. Europeans and South Americans, and the first significant wave of Middle Eastern purchasers who were using Manhattan real estate as a store of value and a statement of global mobility simultaneously. Steven Spielberg was reportedly a buyer. Johnny Carson was reportedly a buyer. The reportedly was doing significant work in those sentences, but the reportedly was itself a marketing instrument, and Trump deployed it with full awareness of its function. The building that was emerging from its scaffolding on Fifth Avenue was, by any objective measure, a significant architectural and commercial achievement. A 58-story tower completed largely on schedule and budget in one of the most complex construction environments on Earth, containing retail, commercial, and residential components that each required separate regulatory approvals, separate financing structures, separate marketing campaigns. The feat of organization and will that the construction represented was genuine, and it deserved the recognition it received in the business press. The atrium, when the scaffolding finally came down and the public was admitted for the first time, produced in most visitors the response Trump had designed it to produce: a sharp intake of breath at the scale of the space, at the warmth of the marble, at the 6-story waterfall that descended a polished wall of stone into a reflecting pool whose surface caught the brass of the railings above. It was extravagant in a way that was also, and this was the design's real achievement, somehow welcoming, the excess softened by the warmth of the stone and the quality of the light into something that felt less like a show of force than an invitation. Trump Tower opened to the public in February 1983, and the city received it with the mixture of admiration and unease that attends any statement too large to ignore and too specific to universally endorse. It was magnificent, and it was much. It was singular, and it was relentless. It was, indisputably, exactly what its builder had said it would be, and the fact that he had said it would be exactly this, years before a single floor of marble had been laid, was perhaps the most remarkable thing about it. What no one standing in that atrium in February 1983 could fully see was that the building had already become, in a sense its developer had not entirely anticipated, a stage rather than merely a structure. That the name across the facade was no longer simply the name of the man who built it, but the name of something larger and more volatile, a brand in the precise modern sense of that word, which is to say a promise that exists independently of any specific product and that carries in its independence the particular risk of promises that cannot be unilaterally revised when the circumstances that made them seem reasonable have changed beyond recognition. The next project was already under contract, and it was larger, and its financing was more leveraged, and the confidence that had carried Trump Tower from a sidewalk appraisal to a Fifth Avenue landmark was, in the projects that followed, going to be required to carry weight that confidence alone had never previously been asked to bear. Chapter 19. Public Works Contrast. The Rink had been closed for 6 years when Trump first looked at it seriously, and it showed. He walked the perimeter of Wollman Rink, on a morning in May 1986 with the particular expression he wore when surveying something that had been allowed to become less than it should be. Not disgust exactly, but a kind of impatient assessment. The look of a man running calculations about what a thing would cost to fix and how long it would take, and why, given those numbers, no one had already fixed it. The Rink sat in the southern end of Central Park, like a patient argument for governmental incompetence. Its concrete surface cracked and heaved, its refrigeration system representing one of the more spectacular engineering failures in the recent history of a city that had produced several strong candidates for that distinction. The wooden boards that had once contained the ice were warped and pulling away from their moorings. The skate rental building had a roof that had given up any pretense of weather resistance. Weeds had established themselves in the joints of the concrete with the confidence of permanent residents. Around the Rink, the park itself was in a state of complicated recovery. The Conservancy had been working since 1980 to reverse decades of deferred maintenance, and the results in the park's more visible sections were becoming apparent. But Wollman Rink remained, in the middle of all this cautious optimism and embarrassment, a closed facility in the heart of a public amenity that 12 million people used each year, a symbol available to anyone who wanted to argue that New York City's government was structurally incapable of managing anything to completion. Trump wanted to make that argument. He had been wanting to make it, in various forms and forums, for most of his adult life. But Wollman Rink gave him something he had not previously had, a concrete stage on which the argument could be performed rather than merely stated, a specific and visible project whose completion would constitute not just a business accomplishment but a rhetorical one. The backstory of the Rink's closure was a bureaucratic narrative so perfectly constructed to illustrate governmental dysfunction that it might have been invented by someone with a polemical agenda, except that it was entirely true. The city had begun renovating Wollman Rink in 1980, acknowledging that the facility's aging refrigeration system needed replacement. The project was budgeted at $9.1 million and was scheduled for completion within 2 years. By 1986, the city had spent more than $12 million, the Rink remained closed, and the refrigeration system, which had been redesigned multiple times by multiple contractors working under multiple city agencies with overlapping and sometimes contradictory authority, had still not been made to function. The brine pipes that were supposed to carry the refrigerant beneath the Rink's surface had been installed incorrectly, then repaired, then found to be leaking, then repaired again, and then discovered to be incompatible with the refrigeration equipment that had been separately specified by a different agency. The city had managed, through 6 years of effort and escalating expenditure, to produce a facility that was in materially worse condition than the one it had set out to improve. New York, in 1986, was a city whose contradictions had become almost definitional. The financial boom that the Reagan years had accelerated was visible on every midtown block, in the construction cranes, in the restaurant openings, in the real estate prices that were climbing with a momentum that made the fiscal crisis seem like ancient history to anyone who had arrived in the city after 1980. Wall Street was in the middle of the most extraordinary bull market in its history. Investment banks were printing money. The acquisition economy, the leveraged buyouts, the hostile takeovers, the corporate raids that Michael Milken's junk bond machine was financing from Beverly Hills, was reshaping the industrial landscape of the country, and New York was the command center of that reshaping, the city where the deals were done and the money was kept and the parties were held to celebrate both. And yet the public infrastructure through which 12 million people moved every day remained, in significant ways, a product of a different and more troubled era. The subways were marginally better than they had been at the nadir of the fiscal crisis, but remained, by the standards of any comparable city in the developed world, a source of daily grievance for their riders. The parks were improving, but unevenly. The schools were struggling. The homeless population, which had grown dramatically through the early 1980s as deinstitutionalization and federal housing cuts interacted with a housing market that was pricing the poor out of the neighborhoods they had occupied for decades, was visible in ways that the city's tourist-facing promotional materials preferred not to acknowledge. This was the world in which the Wollman Rink story landed, a world primed to receive a narrative about public failure, a world in which the contrast between what private enterprise could accomplish and what government bureaucracy could manage had become a charged political and cultural theme rather than merely a managerial observation. Trump had been living inside that theme professionally for 15 years, had been arguing its premises in every public statement about his own projects, had been using the city's dysfunction as the context that made his own competence legible. Wollman Rink was the opportunity to make the theme physical, to translate the argument from assertion into demonstration. In May 1986, he wrote a letter to Mayor Koch offering to rebuild the rink at his own expense, to take over the project, finance it personally, complete it within 6 months, and turn the finished facility back to the city to operate. He asked nothing in return except the right to manage the construction and the implicit acknowledgement that a private developer had accomplished what 6 years of city management had not. He sent the letter with the strategic timing of a man who understood that the offer's public dimension was as important as its private one. It was released to the press simultaneously with its delivery to City Hall, which meant that Koch could not simply file it away and pretend it had not arrived. Koch's initial response was resistant, as Trump had anticipated and perhaps intended. The mayor was not a man who enjoyed being shown up, and the offer's framing, however diplomatically worded in the letter itself, was impossible to misread as anything other than a public accusation of incompetence. Koch had spent 9 years building a reputation as a capable manager of a difficult city, had staked considerable political capital on the argument that New York under his administration was being run with a seriousness that the Lindsay and Beam years had lacked. The Wollman Rink renovation was an embarrassment he had inherited rather than created, but it had persisted on his watch, and Trump's offer made that persistence the story. The core conflict of this chapter was therefore not logistical. Trump's ability to build the rink was never seriously in question, but political and relational. The obstacle was Koch, and Koch was not an obstacle that yielded to the usual pressures. He was too independent, too confident in his own political standing, too temperamentally resistant to the idea that Donald Trump was the solution to any problem that the city of New York encountered. Their relationship had been functional during the years when Trump was navigating the Commodore and Trump Tower approvals, when Koch's interest in private development and Trump's interest in building had aligned sufficiently to sustain cooperation. It had cooled as Trump's public profile had grown large enough to generate its own gravitational field, pulling attention away from the city government and toward the private developer who seemed, in the tabloid coverage of any given week, to be running New York more effectively than its elected officials. The negotiation that followed Trump's letter was conducted partly through official channels and partly through the newspapers, which suited Trump's preferred mode of operation and irritated Koch in direct proportion to its effectiveness. Trump gave interviews in which he described the rink situation with a precision that made the city's failure vivid and specific. He cited the costs, the timeline, the sequence of engineering errors with a command of detail that made him sound like a man who had studied the project more carefully than the agencies responsible for it. He was not wrong about the facts. He deployed them with the rhetorical efficiency of someone who understood that in a tabloid environment, the most damaging argument is usually the most specific one, because specificity forecloses the bureaucratic escape routes of generalization and context. Koch eventually yielded, not gracefully, but yielded, and the agreement that was reached gave Trump the authority to manage the reconstruction, with the city retaining nominal oversight and the understanding that the finished rink would be operated by a private entity under a lease arrangement that would return some revenue to the Parks Department. The revealing action of this episode is not the negotiation but what followed it. Trump finished the rink in 4 months. He came in under his own budget. He opened Wollman Rink on November 1, 1986, 2 months ahead of the 6-month schedule he had publicly committed to, and he opened it with a ceremony that was, in its staging and its media management, as carefully produced as the opening of Trump Tower 3 years earlier. He invited the press. He invited the public. He made a point of noting, in his remarks at the ceremony, that the city had spent 6 years and $12 million to produce a closed rink, and that he had spent 4 months and $2.75 million to produce an open one. He did not frame this as a criticism exactly. He framed it as a fact, and let the assembled journalists draw their own conclusions, which they did with an enthusiasm that suggested they had been waiting for someone to make this particular comparison in this particular public way. Koch attended the opening. He smiled for photographs. He shook Trump's hand. Both men understood that the photograph was a document, that it would appear in newspapers the following morning as evidence of something that each of them interpreted differently, and that the public would interpret in the way that suited its existing views of both men. Koch saw it as a gracious acknowledgement of private generosity. Trump saw it as a portrait of victory. The figure who matters most in this chapter's supporting narrative is not Koch, but the Parks Commissioner, Gordon Davis's successor, Henry Stern, who had inherited the Wollman problem along with the Parks Department's broader recovery effort, and who negotiated the operational details of the arrangement with Trump directly. Stern was a complicated figure, a genuine parks advocate whose knowledge of and feeling for the city's green spaces was authentic, but who was also a pragmatist who understood that the rink's continued closure was doing more damage to the Parks Department's reputation than any arrangement with Trump could do. His willingness to move the negotiation forward, to find the administrative mechanism that allowed the city to accept private assistance without formally acknowledging that it had been rescued, was the bureaucratic achievement that made Trump's public triumph possible. The relationship between the two men was professionally cordial in the manner of people who need something from each other and have decided that the cost of maintaining cordiality is lower than the cost of open hostility. Trump respected Stern's competence in a way he did not always extend to city officials, and Stern appears to have found Trump's combination of impatience and genuine results easier to manage than the combination of deliberation and stasis that had characterized the Rink project under previous administrations. They did not become friends. They became something more durable, in Trump's experience, useful to each other, which was a category he valued more than friendship in any case. The Wollman Rink episode accomplished for Trump's public image something that no tower, however tall, and no hotel, however gleaming, could have produced. It gave him a narrative of public service, of private competence deployed in the civic interest, of a man who could see what needed to be done and do it while the people whose job it was to do it were still filing paperwork. The story was, in its fundamental structure, irresistible, the kind of story that tabloids and television news were designed to tell, because it had a villain, bureaucratic incompetence, a hero, the decisive private citizen, a before, the cracked and weedy ruin, and an after, children skating on November ice in Central Park. Trump understood all of this. He had not rebuilt the rink accidentally or out of civic altruism, operating independently of strategic calculation. He had rebuilt it because he saw, with the same clarity with which he had seen the opportunity in the Commodore Hotel's decline, that Wollman Rink was a story waiting to be told, and that the person who told it by completing it would acquire a form of public credibility that money could not purchase and advertising could not manufacture. What that credibility would be used for was not yet publicly articulated in November 1986. But there were people in Trump's circle who had begun to notice that the arguments he made about Wollman Rink, about the superiority of private management over public administration, about the need for executive decisiveness in the face of bureaucratic paralysis, about the city and the country requiring people who knew how to get things done rather than people who knew how to hold meetings about getting things done, were arguments with a natural extension beyond real estate, beyond New York, beyond any single project or civic gesture. And that Trump was making them with an enthusiasm that seemed, to anyone paying close attention, to be about something larger than a skating rink in Central Park. The question of exactly how large was one that Trump himself had not yet answered publicly, though the interviews he was giving in the months following Wollman's opening contained, for those reading carefully enough, the outlines of an answer that would become, over the following 3 decades, the central fact of American political life. Chapter 20. Constructing the Donald. The gossip columnist was already on the phone before Trump had finished saying hello. This was, by 1983, the natural order of things. Liz Smith had a column in the Daily News that reached more people each morning than most television programs reached in a week, and she had understood earlier than most of her peers that Donald Trump was not merely a source, the conventional relationship between a powerful subject and a working journalist, but a phenomenon whose coverage generated its own momentum, whose name in a headline produced a measurable uptick in newsstand sales, whose statements required no additional context or explanation because the character delivering them had become, through years of careful cultivation and instinctive performance, self-explanatory. He was a story that told itself. All you had to do was answer when he called. He called constantly. Trump dialed reporters the way other executives sent memos, directly, frequently, without the intermediary layer of publicists and communications directors that insulated most men of comparable wealth and ambition from the raw transactional reality of press relations. He had a publicist, but the publicist's role in Trump's media operation was largely administrative, managing the logistics of an outreach program whose creative direction came entirely from Trump himself. He knew which columnists covered which beats, which editors responded to which framings, which photographers could be relied upon to be at a specific location, at a specific time, if the information was delivered with sufficient apparent casualness to make the tip feel like a favor rather than a stage direction. He understood the rhythm of the news cycle, the dead hours between noon and 3 in the afternoon, when a call to the right desk would land a story in the late edition that a call at 9 in the morning would not. And he worked those rhythms with the practiced ease of someone who has internalized a system so completely that operating within it no longer feels like effort. The character that was emerging from this sustained performance in the early 1980s was something genuinely new in the taxonomy of American public figures. Trump was not a celebrity in the conventional sense. He had not acted or recorded or competed in anything that audiences consumed as entertainment. He was not a politician, though he was beginning to speak in the cadences of one when the subject of national competitiveness or urban management arose. He was not quite a businessman in the mode that business journalism typically covered, because business journalism's preferred subject was the corporation rather than the individual, the strategy rather than the personality, the quarterly result rather than the theatrical gesture. He occupied a space that those categories had not yet been designed to describe, a space that the tabloid press, with its instinct for the legible and the vivid, had begun to fill with a word that was not yet fully attached to him, but was becoming so. The word was celebrity, and the process by which a private real estate developer became a celebrity, not incidentally, not accidentally, but through deliberate and sustained manufacture, is one of the more instructive stories of the decade. New York, in the early 1980s, was the ideal laboratory for this experiment. The city had recovered sufficiently from the fiscal crisis to have regained its conviction that it was the center of everything important, and that conviction expressed itself in a media ecosystem of unusual density and competition. There were 4 major daily newspapers fighting for the same readers, each with its own celebrity columnists and gossip franchises and proprietary relationships with the figures who moved through the city's social and commercial infrastructure. There were the glossy magazines New York, W, Vanity Fair in its revived post-1983 form, whose coverage of the city's wealthy operated at a level of aesthetic sophistication that the tabloids could not match, but whose subjects were drawn from the same pool of names. There was local television news, which in New York had a reach and a cultural centrality that it did not possess in smaller markets, and which had developed an appetite for real estate stories in the recovery years that made developers into recognizable figures in a way that would not have been possible in a different city or a different decade. Into this ecosystem, Trump had inserted himself with a consistency and a volume that, by 1983, had produced a saturation of coverage that was itself a story. He was covered not merely as a developer who built things, but as a figure whose opinions about everything, the city's management, the country's trade policies, the design of public spaces, the intelligence of people who disagreed with him, were solicited and published with a regularity that implied a significance extending beyond any specific domain of expertise. The core conflict of this chapter is not external. It is the particular tension that attaches to any sustained act of public self-invention, the risk that the character being constructed will become, through its own internal logic, something different from the person doing the constructing. Trump was manufacturing a version of himself for public consumption, the Donald, as Ivana's usage had filtered into the tabloid vocabulary and stuck there, a formulation that managed simultaneously to be intimate and grand, to suggest both familiarity and the special status of a man referred to in the third person by his own wife, and the manufacturing was, by every available measure, succeeding. The character was landing. The audiences were receiving it. The name was becoming the kind of name that required no last name and a headline, that stood alone, the way only a small handful of names in any generation managed to stand alone. But the character's requirements were beginning to generate their own demands. A persona constructed on the premise of constant winning, of deals that were always the best deals, of buildings that were always the tallest and the most beautiful and the most sought after, was a persona that could not accommodate failure in the way that a more modest self-presentation might. Every project had to be the greatest project. Every negotiation had to be a triumph. Every setback had to be reframed, immediately and publicly, as either a temporary condition or someone else's fault. The character Trump was building required a reality that matched its specifications, and reality, as a general rule, does not accept specifications from its subjects. The revealing action that most directly illuminates the construction of the public persona during this period is not a single dramatic gesture, but a sustained practice that his associates described with a combination of admiration and unease, the Daily Press Review. Trump arrived at the office each morning, having already consumed the relevant sections of 4 or 5 newspapers, and he arrived with annotations, not mental notes but physical marks, paragraphs circled, passages underlined, the names of reporters who had covered him favorably highlighted, and the names of those who had not written down in a separate mental ledger that he maintained with the fidelity of a man who regards memory as a form of justice. He then made calls. He called to thank journalists who had written things he liked, not in the vague terms of a routine courtesy, but specifically with references to particular sentences or framings that he had found useful, in a way that told the reporter he had actually read the piece rather than merely been told about it. The specificity of his praise was itself a form of flattery, because it implied close attention from a man whose attention was valuable. The calls to journalists who had written things he did not like were conducted in a different register, but with an equal specificity. He did not threaten. He argued. He disputed characterizations with the detailed engagement of a man who believed that every unflattering account of him was the product of either insufficient information or active malice, and who was willing to spend 45 minutes on the telephone correcting the record with someone who had written 3 paragraphs about a zoning decision. The effect of these calls was not always to change coverage in any specific way. It was to establish, in the mind of every journalist who covered New York real estate and New York society and New York politics, that writing something negative about Donald Trump would produce a personal response from Donald Trump, delivered directly and at length, and that this consequence had to be factored into the decision about whether the story was worth the engagement it would generate. This was not intimidation in any legally cognizable sense. It was a form of attritional pressure that operated through the specific mechanics of the journalist's psychology. The awareness that a phone call was coming, that the call would be detailed and insistent, that it would require a defense of professional judgments that most reporters prefer not to have to make out loud to the subjects of their stories. Some journalists found this energizing. Others found it exhausting. Almost all of them took Trump's calls, because not taking them meant missing a quote that would appear in the next day's column somewhere else. The figure who most significantly shaped the construction of the public persona during this period was not a journalist, but a publicist who operated as something closer to a collaborator, Howard Rubenstein, whose firm represented Trump during portions of this era alongside other communications relationships, was one of the figures through whom Trump's press strategy was sometimes routed. But the more revealing relationship, the one that most directly illuminates how the Donald was assembled as a public product, was with Liz Smith herself. Smith had recognized Trump's tabloid potential earlier than most of her peers, and their relationship developed into something more symbiotic than the standard source-columnist dynamic. She gave him coverage. He gave her access, quotes, information about his deals and his social life that her competitors could not match. He invited her to events. He called her with tips that were sufficiently interesting and sufficiently pre-packaged for her purposes that they required minimal additional reporting to become publishable items. She was not an instrument he played. She was too sophisticated and too independently powerful for that characterization to be fair, but she was a participant in a collaborative enterprise whose product was the public image of Donald Trump, and she understood her participation well enough to be slightly rueful about it in retrospect, in the way that people who have been genuinely charmed by someone sometimes feel when the charm is examined in better light. What Smith provided, beyond the coverage itself, was a form of social legitimacy that pure business press could not supply. Her column placed Trump in the context of New York's cultural and social elite, at dinner parties and gallery openings, and charity events alongside the names that mattered in the city's glamour economy. And this placement told readers something important about what kind of figure Trump was becoming. He was not merely a successful developer. He was a presence, a social force, someone whose attendance at an event elevated the event in the same way that certain names elevate any room they enter. This was a category of significance entirely separate from net worth or business accomplishment, and it was a category that Trump understood and pursued with the same systematic intensity he brought to everything else. The tabloid nickname, the Donald, crystallized something that had been developing for years. It captured the essential paradox of the persona, simultaneously intimate and grand, affectionate and mocking, a construction that held both the genuine and the performed in a single formulation without resolving the tension between them. The people who used it did not entirely know whether they were celebrating or satirizing, and Trump did not seem to care about the distinction, which was itself revealing. Satire requires a subject who is embarrassable, who can be made to feel the gap between the inflated image and the deflated reality. Trump appeared constitutionally resistant to embarrassment, or had found a way to metabolize it so quickly that the gap never opened long enough for irony to establish itself. By the mid-1980s, the persona had achieved the condition that its manufacturer had been working toward: self-sustaining momentum. Trump no longer needed to generate every story. Stories generated themselves, because the character was now sufficiently established that anything associated with it became, by that association alone, of interest to the audience that had been assembled around it. His buildings were stories. His opinions were stories. His marriage was a story. His airplane was a story. The sheer accumulation of coverage had produced a readership that was interested not in any particular aspect of Trump, but in Trump as a continuing serial, a figure whose next chapter was perpetually anticipated, whose presence in any situation could be relied upon to produce quotable, visual, emotionally legible material. This was an extraordinary achievement, and it was achieved through work, through the daily discipline of attention to the press, through the willingness to be available at hours that other public figures of comparable stature considered ungovernable, through the intuitive mastery of a media environment that Trump had studied more carefully and understood more precisely than the journalists who covered him sometimes realized. The persona was a construction, but constructions of sufficient ambition and sufficient execution take on a life that exceeds their origins, and the Donald had by 1987 become something larger than the strategy that produced it. What no construction of this kind can finally control is the relationship between the image and the underlying reality, the degree to which the persona's requirements and the person's capacities continue to align as the scale of both expands. Trump was about to enter a period in which the deals would become larger, the leverage would become more extreme, the persona's appetite for triumph would encounter a business environment whose cooperation could not be secured through phone calls and tabloid management, and the gap that the tabloid nickname had held in comfortable suspension would begin, slowly and then with gathering speed, to make itself felt in ways that the morning press review could not close. The book that bore his name and his philosophy, The Art of the Deal, whose composition was already underway with a collaborator whose contribution to the prose would itself become, in time, a story, was going to tell America who Donald Trump was, in his own account of himself, and America was going to find the account irresistible, and the irresistibility was going to carry him into rooms and situations for which the character he had built, however brilliantly, had not been fully designed.